5. Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda. During the past decade, the nature and content of the speeches and pamphlets of American fascist agitators have been subjected to intensive research by social scientists. Some of these studies, undertaken along the lines of content analysis, have finally led to a comprehensive presentation in the book, Prophets of Deceit, by L. Lowenthal and N. Guterman. The overall picture obtained is characterized by two main features. First, with the exception of some bizarre and completely negative recommendations, to put aliens into concentration camps or to expatriate Zionists, fascist propaganda material in this country is little concerned with concrete and tangible political issues. The overwhelming majority of all agitator statements are directed at homonym. They are obviously based on psychological calculations rather than on the intention to gain followers through the rational statement of rational aims. The term rabble-rouser, though objectionable because of its inherent contempt of the masses as such, is adequate insofar as it expresses the atmosphere of irrational emotional aggressiveness purposely promoted by our would-be Hitlers. If it is an impudence to call people rabble, it is precisely the aim of the agitator to transform the very same people, Freudian theory 133, into rabble, that is, crowds bent on violent action without any sensible political aim, and to create the atmosphere of the pogrom. The universal purpose of these agitators is to instigate methodically what, since Gustave Le Bon's famous book, Psychologie des Foules, is commonly known as the psychology of the masses. Second, the agitator's approach is truly systematical and follows a rigidly set pattern of clear-cut devices. This does not merely pertain to the ultimate unity of the political purpose, the abolition of democracy through mass support against the democratic principle, but even more so to the intrinsic nature of the content and presentation of propaganda itself. The similarity of the utterances of various agitators, from much publicized figures such as Coughlin and Gerald Smith to provincial smaller-time hate-mongers, is so great that it suffices in principle to analyze the statements of one of them in order to know them all. Moreover, the speeches themselves are so monotonous that one meets with endless repetitions as soon as one is acquainted with the very limited number of stock devices. As a matter of fact, constant reiteration and scarcity of ideas are indispensable ingredients of the entire technique. While the mechanical rigidity of the pattern is obvious and itself the expression of certain psychological aspects of fascist mentality, one cannot help feeling that propaganda material of the fascist brand forms a structural unit with a total common conception, be it conscious or unconscious, which determines every word that is said. This structural unit seems to refer to the implicit political conception as well as to the psychological essence. So far, only the detached and in a way isolated nature of each device has been given scientific attention. The psychoanalytic connotations of the devices have been stressed and elaborated. Now that the elements have been cleared up sufficiently, the time has come to focus attention on the psychological system as such, and it may not be entirely accidental that the term summons the association of paranoia, which comprises and begets these elements. This seems to be the more appropriate since otherwise the psychoanalytical interpretation of the individual devices will remain somewhat haphazard and arbitrary. A kind of theoretical frame of reference will have to be evolved, inasmuch as the individual devices call almost irresistibly for psychoanalytic interpretation. It is but logical to postulate that this 34 the culture industry frame of reference should consist of the application of a more comprehensive, basic psychoanalytic theory to the agitator's overall approach. Such a frame of reference has been provided by Freud himself in his book Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, published in English as early as 1922, and long before the danger of German fascism appeared to be acute. It is not an overstatement if we say that Freud, though he was hardly interested in the political phase of the problem, clearly foresaw the rise and nature of fascist mass movements in purely psychological categories. If it is true that the analyst's unconscious perceives the unconscious of the patient, one may also presume that his theoretical intuitions are capable of anticipating tendencies still latent on a rational level but manifesting themselves on a deeper one. It may not have been perchance that after the First World War Freud turned his attention to narcissism and ego problems in the specific sense. The mechanisms and instinctual conflicts involved evidently play an increasingly important role in the present epoch, whereas, according to the testimony of practicing analysts, the classical neuroses such as conversion hysteria, which served as models for the method, now occur less frequently than at the time of Freud's own development when Charcot dealt with hysteria clinically and Ibsen made it the subject matter of some of his plays. According to Freud, the problem of mass psychology is closely related to the new type of psychological affliction so characteristic of the era which for socio-economic reasons witnesses the decline of the individual and his subsequent weakness. While Freud did not concern himself with the social changes, it may be said that he developed within the monadological confines of the individual the traces of its profound crisis and willingness to yield, unquestioningly to powerful outside, collective agencies, without ever devoting himself to the study of contemporary social developments. Freud has pointed to historical trends through the development of his own work, the choice of his subject matters, and the evolution of guiding concepts. The method of Freud's book constitutes a dynamic interpretation of Le Bon's description of the mass mind and a critique of a few dogmatic concepts, magic words, as it were, which are employed by Le Bon and other pre-analytic psychologists as though they were keys for some Freudian theory 135 startling phenomena. Foremost among these concepts is that of Suggs T, which, incidentally, still plays a large role as a stopgap in popular thinking about the spell exercised by Hitler and his like over the masses. Freud does not challenge the accuracy of Le Bon's well-known characterizations of masses as being largely de-individualized, irrational, easily influenced, prone to violent action and altogether of a regressive nature. What distinguishes him from Le Bon is rather the absence of the traditional contempt for the masses which is the theme of probandum of most of the older psychologists. Instead of inferring from the usual descriptive findings that the masses are inferior per se and likely to remain so, he asks in the spirit of true enlightenment, what makes the masses into masses? He rejects the easy hypothesis of a social or herd instinct, which for him denotes the problem and not its solution. In addition to the purely psychological reasons he gives for this rejection, one might say that he is on safe ground also from the sociological point of view. The straightforward comparison of modern mass formations with biological phenomena can hardly be regarded as valid since the the members of contemporary masses are at least prima facie individuals, the children of a liberal, competitive and individualistic society, and conditioned to maintain themselves as independent, self-sustaining units, they are continuously admonished to be rugged and warned against surrender. Even if one were to assume that archaic, pre-individual instincts survive, one could not simply point to this inherent instincts but would have to explain why modern men revert to patterns of behavior which flagrantly contradict their own rational level in the present stage of enlightened technological civilization. This is precisely what Freud wants to do. He tries to find out which psychological forces result in the transformation of individuals into a mass. If the individuals in the group are combined into a unity, there must surely be something to unite them, and this bond might be precisely the thing that is characteristic of a group. This quest, however, is tantamount to an exposition of the fundamental issue of fascist manipulation. For the fascist demagogue, who has to win the support of millions of people for aims largely incompatible with their own rational self-interest, can do so only by artificially creating the bond Freud is looking for. If the demagogue's approach is at all realistic, and their popular success leaves no doubt that it is, it might be hypothesized that the bond in 36 the culture industry question is the very same the demagogue tries to produce synthetically. In fact, that it is the unifying principle behind his various devices. In accordance with general psychoanalytic theory, Freud believes that the bond which integrates individuals into a mass is of a libidinal nature. Earlier psychologists have occasionally hit upon this aspect of mass psychology. In McDougall's opinion, men's emotions are stirred in a group to a pitch that they seldom or never attain under other conditions, and it is a pleasurable experience for those who are concerned to surrender themselves so unreservedly to their passions and thus to become merged in the group and to lose the sense of the limits of their individuality. Freud goes beyond such observations by explaining the coherence of masses altogether in terms of the pleasure principle, that is to say, the actual or vicarious gratifications individuals obtain from surrendering to a mass. Hitler, by the way, was well aware of the libidinal source of mass formation through surrender when he attributed specifically female, passive features to the participants of his meetings, and thus also hinted at the role of unconscious homosexuality in mass psychology. The most important consequence of Freud's introduction of libido into group psychology is that the traits generally ascribed to masses lose the deceptively primordial and irreducible character reflected by the arbitrary construct of specific mass or herd instincts. The latter are effects rather than causes. What is peculiar to the masses is, according to Freud, not so much a new quality as the manifestation of old ones usually hidden. From our point of view, we need not attribute so much importance to the appearance of new characteristics. For us it would be enough to say that in a group the individual is brought under conditions which allow him to throw off the repressions of his unconscious instincts. Oh, this does not only dispense with auxiliary hypotheses ad hoc but also does justice to the simple fact that those who become submerged in masses are not primitive men but display primitive attitudes contradictory to their normal rational behavior. Yet, even the most trivial descriptions leave no doubt about the affinity of certain peculiarities of masses to archaic traits. Particular mention should be made here of the potential shortcut from violent emotions to violent actions stressed by all authors on mass psychology, a phenomenon which in Freud's writings on primitive cultures leads to the assumption that the murder of the father of the primary horde is, Frudelum theory 137, not imaginary but corresponds to prehistoric reality. In terms of dynamic theory, the revival of such traits is to be understood as the result of a conflict. It may also help to explain some of the manifestations of fascist mentality which could hardly be grasped without the assumption of an antagonism between varied psychological forces. One is to think here above all of the psychological category of destructiveness with which Freud dealt in his Civilization and its discontents. As a rebellion against civilization, fascism is not simply the reoccurrence of the archaic but its reproduction in and by civilization itself. It is hardly adequate to define the forces of fascist rebellion simply as powerful ideologies which throw off the pressure of the existing social order. Rather, this rebellion borrows its energies partly from other psychological agencies which are pressed into the service of the unconscious. Since the libidinal bond between members of masses is obviously not of an uninhibited sexual nature, the problem arises as to which psychological mechanisms transform primary sexual energy into feelings which hold masses together. Freud copes with the problem by analyzing the phenomena covered by the terms suggestion and suggestibility. He recognizes suggestion as the shelter or screen concealing love relationships. It is essential that the love relationship behind suggestion remains unconscious. Freud dwells on the fact that in organized groups such as the army or the church there is either no mention of love whatsoever between the members, or it is expressed only in a sublimated and indirect way, through the mediation of some religious image in the lover whom the members unite and whose all-embracing love they are supposed to imitate in their attitude towards each other. It seems significant that in today's society with its artificially integrated fascist masses, reference to love is almost completely excluded. Hitler shunned the traditional role of the loving father and replaced it entirely by the negative one of threatening authority. The concept of love was relegated to the abstract notion of Germany and seldom mentioned without the epithet of fanatical, through which even this love obtained a ring of hostility and aggressiveness against those not encompassed by it. It is one of the basic tenets of fascist leadership to keep primary libidinal energy on an unconscious level so as to divert its manifestations in a way suitable to political ends. The less 38 the culture industry, an objective idea such as religious salvation plays a role in mass formity on, and the more mass manipulation becomes the sole aim, the more thoroughly uninhibited love has to be repressed and molded into obedience. There is too little in the content of fascist ideology that could be loved. The libidinal pattern of fascism and the entire technique of fascist demagogues are authoritarian. This is where the techniques of the demagogue and the hypnotist coincide with the psychological mechanism by which individuals are made to undergo the regressions which reduce them to mere members of a group. By the measures that he takes, the hypnotist awakens in the subject a portion of his archaic inheritance which had also made him compliant towards his parents and which had experienced an individual reanimation in his relation to his father. What is thus awakened is the idea of a paramount and dangerous personality, towards whom only a passive masochistic attitude is possible, to whom one's will has to be surrendered, while to be alone with him, to look him in the face, appears a hazardous enterprise. LT is only in some such way as this that we can picture the relation of the individual member of the primal, the uncanny and coercive characteristics of group formations, which are shown in their suggestion phenomena, may therefore with justice be traced back to the fact of their origin from the primal horde. The leader of the group is still the dreaded primal father. The group still wishes to be governed by unrestricted force. It has an extreme passion for authority. In Le Bon's phrase, it has a thirst for obedience. The primal father is the group ideal, which governs the ego in the place of the ego ideal. Hypnosis has a good claim to being described as a group of two. There remains as a definition for suggestion, a conviction which is not based upon to the primal father perception and reasoning but upon an erotic tie. This actually defines the nature and content of fascist propaganda. It is psychological because of its irrational authoritarian aims which cannot be attained by means of rational convictions but only through the skillful awakening of a portion of the subject's archaic inheritance. Fascist agitation is centered in the idea of the leader, no matter whether, Freudian theory 139, he actually leads or is only the mandatory of group interests, because only the psychological image of the leader is apt to reanimate the idea of the all-powerful and threatening primal father. This is the ultimate root of the otherwise enigmatic personalization of fascist propaganda, its incessant plugging of names and supposedly great men, instead of discussing objective causes. The formation of the imagery of an omnipotent and unbridled father figure, by far transcending the individual father and therewith apt to be enlarged into a group ego, is the only way to promulgate the passive, masochistic attitude after whom one's will has to be surrendered, an attitude required of the fascist follower the more his political behavior becomes irreconcilable with his own rational interests as a private person as well as those of the group or class to which he actually belongs. The follower's reawakened irrationality is, therefore, quite rational from the leader's viewpoint. It necessarily has to be a conviction which is not based upon perception and reasoning but upon an erotic tie. The mechanism which transforms libido into the bond between leader and followers, and between the followers themselves, is that of identification. A great part of Freud's book is devoted to its analysis. It is impossible to discuss here the very subtle theoretical differentiation, particularly the one between identification and introjection. It should be noted, however, that the late Ernst Simmel, to whom we owe valuable contributions to the psychology of fascism, took up Freud's concept of the ambivalent nature of identification as a derivative of the oral phase of the organization of the libido, and expanded it into an analytic theory of anti-Semitism. We content ourselves with a few observations on the relevancy of the doctrine of identification to fascist propaganda and fascist mentality. It has been observed by several authors and by Erich Homburger Eriksson in particular, that the specifically fascist leader type does not seem to be a father figure such as for instance the king of former times. The inconsistency of this observation with Freud's theory of the leader as the primal father, however, is only superficial. His discussion of identification may well help us to understand, in terms of subjective dynamics, certain changes which are actually due to objective historical conditions. Identification is the earliest expression of an emotional tie with another person, playing a part in the early history of the culture industry, Oedipus complex. It may well be that this pre-Oedipal component of identification helps to bring about the separation of the leader image as that of an all-powerful primal father from the actual father image, since the child's identification with his father as an answer to the Oedipus complex is only a secondary phenomenon. Infantile regression may go beyond this father image and through an analytic process reach a more archaic one. Moreover, the primitively narcissistic aspect of identification as an act of devouring, of making the beloved object part of oneself, may provide us with a clue to the fact that the modern leader image sometimes seems to be the enlargement of the subject's own personality, a collective projection of himself, rather than the image of the father whose role during the later phases of the subject's infancy may well have decreased in present-day society. All these facets call for further clarification. The essential role of narcissism in regard to the identifications which are at play in the formation of fascist groups is recognized in Freud's theory of idealization. We see that the object is being treated in the same way as our own ego, so that when we are in love a considerable amount of narcissistic libido overflows on the object. It is even obvious, in many forms of love choice, that the object serves as a substitute for some unattained ego ideal of our own. We love it on account of the perfections which we have striven to reach for our own ego, and which we should now like to procure in this roundabout way as a means of satisfying our narcissism. 17. It is precisely this idealization of himself which the fascist leader tries to promote in his followers, and which is helped by the Führer ideology. The people he has to reckon with generally undergo the characteristic modern conflicts between a strongly developed rational, self-preserving ego agency and the continuous failure to satisfy their own ego demands. This conflict results in strong narcissistic impulses which can be absorbed and satisfied only through idealization as the partial transfer of the narcissistic libido to the object. This, again, falls in line with the semblance of the leader image to an enlargement of the subject. By making the leader his ideal he loves himself, as it were, but gets rid of the stains of frustration and discontent which mar his picture of his own empirical self. This pattern of identification through idealization, the caricature of true conscious solidarity, is, however, a collective one. It is effective in vast numbers of Freudian theory 41. People with similar characterological dispositions and libidinal leanings. The fascist community of the people corresponds exactly to Freud's definition of a group as being a number of individuals who have substituted one and the same object for their ego ideal and have consequently identified themselves with one another. In their ego, the leader image, in turn, borrows as it were its primal father-like omnipotence and collective strength. 19. Freud's psychological construction of the leader imagery is corroborated by its striking coincidence with the fascist leader type, at least as far as its public build-up is concerned. His descriptions fit the picture of Hitler no less than idealizations into which the American demagogues try to style themselves. In order to allow narcissistic identification, the leader has to appear himself as absolutely narcissistic, and it is from this insight that Freud derives the portrait of the primal father of the horde which might as well be Hitler's. He, at the very beginning of the history of mankind, was the Superman degrees whom Nietzsche only expected from the future. Even today, the members of a group stand in need of the illusion that they are equally and justly loved by their leader, but the leader himself need love no one else. He may be of a masterly nature, absolutely narcissistic, but self-conscious confident and independent. We know that love puts a check upon narcissism, and it would be possible to show how, by operating in this way, it became a factor of civilization. One of the most conspicuous features of the agitator speeches, namely the absence of a positive program and of anything they might give, as well as the paradoxical prevalence of threat and denial, is thus being accounted for. The leader can be loved only if he himself does not love. Yet Freud is aware of another aspect of the leader image which apparently contradicts the first one. While appearing as a Superman, the leader must at the same time work the miracle of appearing as an average person, just as Hitler posed as a composite of King Kong and the suburban barber. This too, Freud explains through his theory of narcissism. According to him, the individual gives up his ego ideal and substitutes for it the group. 42. The culture industry, ideal as embodied in the leader. However, in many individuals the separation between the ego and the ego ideal is not very far advanced. The two still coincide readily. The ego has often preserved its earlier self-complacency. The selection of the leader is very much facilitated by this circumstance. He need only possess the typical qualities of the individuals concerned in a particularly clearly marked and pure form, and need only give an impression of greater force and of more freedom of libido. And in that case the need for a strong chief will often meet him halfway and invest him with a predominance to which he would otherwise perhaps have had no claim. The other members of the group, whose ego ideal would not, apart from this, have become embodied in his person without some correction, are then carried away with the rest by suggestion, that is to say, by means of identification. Even the fascist leader's startling symptoms of inferiority, his resemblance to ham actors and to social psychopaths, is thus anticipated in Freud's theory. For the sake of those parts of the follower's narcissistic libido which have not been thrown into the leader image but remain attached to the follower's own ego, the Superman must still resemble the follower and appear as his enlargement. Accordingly, one of the basic devices of personalized fascist propaganda is the concept of a great little man, a person who suggests both omnipotence and the idea that he is just one of the folks, a clean, red-blooded American, untainted by material or spiritual wealth. Psychological ambivalence helps to work a social miracle. The leader image gratifies the follower's twofold wish to submit to authority and to be the authority himself. This fits into a world in which irrational control is exercised though it has lost its inner conviction through universal enlightenment. The people who obey the dictators also sense the latter are superfluous. They reconcile this contradiction through the assumption that they are themselves the ruthless oppressor. All the agitator's standard devices are designed along the line of Freud's expose of what became later the basic structure of fascist demagoguery, the technique of personalization, and the idea of the great little man. We limit ourselves to a few examples picked at random. Freudian Theory 43. Freud gives an exhaustive account of the hierarchical element in irrational groups. It is obvious that a soldier takes a superior, that is, really, the leader of the army, as his ideal, while he identifies himself with his equals, and derives from this community of their egos the obligations for giving mutual help and for sharing posses signs which comradeship implies. But he becomes ridiculous if he tries to identify himself with the general, to wit, consciously and directly. The fascists, down to the last small tin demagogue, continuously emphasize ritualistic ceremonies and hierarchical differentiations. The less hierarchy within the setup of a highly rationalized and quantified industrial society is warranted. The more artificial hierarchies with no objective raison d'etre are built up and rigidly imposed by fascists for purely technical reasons. It may be added, however, that this is not the only libidinous source involved. Thus, hierarchical structures are in complete keeping with the wishes of the sadomasochistic character. Hitler's famous formula, Verantwortung nach oben, Autorität nach unten, responsibility towards above, authority towards below nicely rationalizes this character's ambivalence. 25. The tendency to tread on those below, which manifests itself so disastrously in the persecution of weak and helpless minorities, is as outspoken as the hatred against those outside. In practice, both tendencies quite frequently fall together. Freud's theory sheds light on the all-pervasive, rigid distinction between the beloved in-group and the rejected out-group. Throughout our culture, this way of thinking and behaving has come to be regarded as self-evident to such a degree that the question of why people love what is like themselves and hate what is different is rarely asked seriously enough. Here as in many other instances, the productivity of Freud's approach lies in his questioning that which is generally accepted. Le Bon had noticed that the irrational crowd goes directly to extremes. Freud expands this observation and points out that the dichotomy between in and out groups is of so deep-rooted in nature that it affects even those groups whose ideas apparently exclude such reactions. By 1921, he was therefore able to dispense with the liberalistic illusion that the progress of civilization would automatically bring about an increase of tolerance and a lessening of violence against out groups. 44. The culture industry. Even during the kingdom of Christ, those people who do not belong to the community of believers, who do not love him, and whom he does not love, stand outside this tie. Therefore, so religion, even if it calls itself the religion of love, must be hard and unloving to those who do not belong to it. Fundamentally, indeed, every religion is in the same way a religion of love for all those whom it embraces, while cruelty and intolerance towards those who do not belong to it are natural to every religion. However difficult we may find it personally, we ought not to reproach believers too severely on this account. People who are unbelieving or indifferent are so much better off psychologically in this respect. If today that intolerance no longer shows itself so violent and cruel as in former centuries, we can scarcely conclude that there has been a softening in human manners. The cause is rather to be found in the undeniable weakening of religious feelings and the libidinal ties which depend upon them. If another group tie takes the place of the religious one, and the socialistic tie seems to be succeeding in doing so, then there will be the same intolerance towards outsiders as in the age of the wars of religion. 7. Freud's error in political prognosis, his blaming the socialists for what their German arch-enemies did, is as striking as his prophecy of fascist destructiveness, the drive to eliminate the out-group. As a matter of fact, neutralization of religion seems to have led to just the opposite of what the enlightener Freud anticipated. The division between the believers and the non-believers has been maintained and reified. However, it has become a structure in itself, independent of any ideational content, and is even more stubbornly defended since it lost its inner conviction. At the same time, the mitigating impact of the religious doctrine of love vanished. This is the essence of the sheep and goat device employed by all fascist demagogues. Since they do not recognize any spiritual criterion in regard to who is chosen and who is 29 rejected, they substitute a pseudo-natural criterion such as the race, which seems to be inescapable and can therefore be applied even more mercilessly than was the concept of heresy during the Middle Ages. Freud has succeeded in identifying the libidinal function of this device. It acts as a negatively integrating force, since the positive libido is completely invested in the image of the primal father, the leader, and, Freudian theory 145, since few positive contents are available, a negative one has to be found. The leader or the leading idea might also, so to speak, be negative. Hatred against a particular person or institution might operate in just the same unifying way, and might call up the same kind of emotional ties as positive attachment. It goes without saying that this negative integration feeds on the instinct of destructiveness to which Freud does not explicitly refer in his group psychology, the decisive role of which he has, however, recognized in his civilization and its discontents. In the present context, Freud explains the hostility against the outgroup with narcissism, in the undisguised antipathies and aversions which people feel towards strangers with whom they have to do. We may recognize the expression of self-love, of narcissism. This self-love works for the self-assertion of the individual, and behaves as though the occurrence of any divergence from his own particular lines of development involved a criticism of them and a demand for their alteration. The narcissistic gain provided by fascist propaganda is obvious. It suggests continuously and sometimes in rather devious ways, that the follower, simply through belonging to the in-group, is better, higher and purer than those who are excluded. At the same time, any kind of critique or self-awareness is resented as a narcissistic loss and elicits rage. It accounts for the violent reaction of all fascists against what they deem ersatz, that which debunks their own stubbornly maintained values, and it also explains the hostility of prejudiced persons against any kind of introspection. Concomitantly, the concentration of hostility upon the outgroup does away with intolerance in one's own group to which one's relation would otherwise be highly ambivalent, but the whole of this intolerance vanishes, temporarily or permanently, as the result of the formation of a group, and in a group, so long as a group formation persists or so far as it extends, individuals behave as though they were uniform, tolerate other people's peculiarities, put themselves on an equal level with them, and have no feeling of aversion towards them. Such a limitation of narcissism can, 46 The culture industry, according to our theoretical views, only be produced by one factor, a libidinal tie with other people. This is the line pursued by the agitators' standard unity trick. They emphasize their being different from the outsider but play down such differences within their own group and tend to level out distinctive qualities among themselves with the exception of the hierarchical one. We are all in the same boat, nobody should be better off. The snob, the intellectual, the pleasure seeker are always attacked. The undercurrent of malicious egalitarianism, of the brotherhood of all compromising humiliation, is a component of fascist propaganda and fascism itself. It found its symbol in Hitler's notorious command of the Einheitsgericht. The less they want the inherent social structure changed, the more they prate about social justice, meaning that no member of the community of the people should indulge in individual pleasures. Repressive egalitarianism instead of realization of true equality through the abolition of repression is part and parcel of the fascist mentality and reflected in the agitators' if you only new device which promises the vindictive revelation of all sorts of forbidden pleasures enjoyed by others. Freud interprets this phenomenon in terms of the transformation of individuals into members of the psychological brotherhood. Their coherence is a reaction formation against their primary jealousy of each other, pressed into the service of group coherence. What appears later on in society in the shape of Gemeingeist, esprit de corps, group spirit, etc. does not belie its derivation from what was originally envy. No one must want to put himself forward. Everyone must be the same and have the same. Social justice means that we deny ourselves many things so that others may have to do with them as well. Or, what is the same thing, may not be able to ask for them. 3. It may be added that the ambivalence towards the brother has found a rather striking, ever-recurring expression in the agitator's technique. Freud and Rank have pointed out that in fairy tales, small animals such as bees and ants would be the brothers in the primal horde, just as in Freudian theory 47. The same way in dream symbolism insects or vermin signify brothers and sisters, contemptuously, considered as babies. Since the members of the in-group have supposedly succeeded in identifying themselves with one another by means of similar love for the same object, they cannot admit this contempt for each other. Thus, it is expressed by completely negative cathexis of these low animals, fused with hatred against the outgroup, and projected upon the latter. Actually, it is one of the favorite devices of fascist agitators, examined in great detail by Leo Lowenthal to compare our groups, all foreigners and particularly refugees and Jews, with low animals and vermin. If we are entitled to assume a correspondence of fascist propagandist stimuli to the mechanisms elaborated in Freud's group psychology, we have to ask ourselves the almost inevitable question: how did the fascist agitators, crude and semi-educated as they were, obtain knowledge of these mechanisms? Reference to the influence exercised by Hitler's Mein Kampf upon the American demagogues would not lead very far, since it seems impossible that Hitler's theoretical knowledge of group psychology went beyond the non-trivial observations derived from a popularized Laban. Neither can it be maintained that Goebbels was a mastermind of propaganda and fully aware of the most advanced findings of modern depth psychology. Perusal of his speeches and selections from his recently published diaries give the impression of a person shrewd enough to play the game of power politics but utterly naive and superficial in regard to all social or psychological issues below the surface of his own catchwords and newspaper editorials. The idea of the sophisticated and radical intellectual Goebbels is part of the devil's legend associated with his name and fostered by ego journalism, a legend, incidentally, which itself calls for psychoanalytic explanation. Goebbels himself thought in stereotypes and was completely under the spell of personalization. Thus, we have to seek for sources other than erudition for the much advertised fascist command of psychological techniques of mass manipulation. The foremost source seems to be the already mentioned basic identity of leader and follower, which circumscribes one of the aspects of identification. The leader can guess the psychological wants and needs of those susceptible to his propaganda because he resembles them psychologically, and is distinguished from them by a capacity to express without 48 satiate the culture industry, inhibitions what is latent in them, rather than by any intrinsic superiority. The leaders are generally oral character types, with a compulsion to speak incessantly and to befool the others. The famous spell they exercise over their followers seems largely to depend on their orality. Language itself, devoid of its rational significance, functions in a magical way and furthers those archaic regressions which reduce individuals to members of crowds. Since this very quality of uninhibited but largely associative speech presupposes at least a temporary lack of ego control, it may well indicate weakness rather than strength. The fascist agitators boasting of strength is indeed frequently accompanied by hints at such weakness, particularly when begging for monetary contributions, hints which, to be sure, are skillfully merged with the idea of strength itself. In order successfully to meet the unconscious dispositions of his audience, the agitator, so to speak, simply turns his own unconscious outward. His particular character syndrome makes it possible for him to do exactly this, and experience has taught him consciously to exploit this faculty, to make rational use of his irrationality, similarly to the actor, or a certain type of journalist who knows how to sell their innovations and sensitivity. Without knowing it, he is thus able to speak and act in accord with the psychological theory for the simple reason that the psychological theory is true. All he has to do in order to make the psychology of his audience click, is shrewdly to exploit his own psychology. The adequacy of the agitator's devices to the psychological basis of their aim is further enhanced by another factor. As we know, fascist agitation has by now come to be a profession, as it were, a livelihood. It had plenty of time to test the effectiveness of its various appeals and, through what might be called natural selection, only the most catchy ones have survived. Their effectiveness is itself a function of the psychology of the consumers. Through a process of freezing, which can be observed throughout the techniques employed in modern mass culture, the surviving appeals have been standardized, similarly to the advertising slogans which prove to be most valuable in the promotion of business. This standardization, in turn, falls in line with the stereotypical thinking, that is to say, with the stereopathy of those susceptible to this propaganda and their infantile wish for endless, unaltered repetition. It is hard to predict whether the latter psychological, Freudian theory 149, disposition will prevent the agitator's standard devices from becoming blunt through excessive application. In National Socialist Germany, everybody used to make fun of certain propagandistic phrases such as blood and soil, Blut and Boden, jokingly called bubo, or the concept of the Nordic race from which the verb of Norden, to northernize, was derived. Nevertheless, these appeals do not seem to have lost their attractiveness. Rather, their very phoniness may have been relished cynically and sadistically as an index for the fact that power alone decided one's fate in the Third Reich, that is, power unhampered by rational objectivity. Furthermore, one may ask, why is the applied group psychology discussed here peculiar to fascism rather than to most other movements that seek mass support? Even the most casual comparison of fascist propaganda with that of liberal, progressive parties will show this to be so. Yet, neither Freud nor Le Bon envisaged such a distinction. They spoke of crowds as such, similar to the conceptualizations used by formal sociology, without differentiating between the political aims of the groups involved. As a matter of fact, both thought of traditional socialistic movements rather than of their opposite, though it should be noted that the church and the army, the examples chosen by Freud for the demonstration of this theory, are essentially conservative and hierarchical. Le Bon, on the other hand, is mainly concerned with non-organized, spontaneous, ephemeral crowds. Only an explicit theory of society, by far transcending the range of psychology, can fully answer the question raised here. We content ourselves with a few suggestions. First, the objective aims of fascism are largely irrational insofar as they contradict the material interest of great numbers of those whom they try to embrace. Notwithstanding the pre-war boom of the first years of the Hitler regime, the continuous danger of war inherent in fascism spells destruction, and the masses are at least preconsciously aware of it. Thus, fascism does not altogether speak the untruth when it refers to its own irrational powers, however fake the mythology which ideologically rationalizes the irrational may be. Since it would be impossible for fascism to win the masses through rational arguments, its propaganda must necessarily be deflected from discursive thinking. It must be oriented psychologically, and has to mobilize irrational, unconscious, regressive processes. This task is facilitated by the frame of mind of all, T50 the culture industry, those strata of the population who suffer from senseless frustrations and therefore develop a stunted, irrational mentality. It may well be the secret of fascist propaganda that it simply takes men for what they are, the true children of today's standardized mass culture, largely robbed of autonomy and spontaneity, instead of setting goals the realization of which would transcend the psychological status quo no less than the social one. Fascist propaganda has only to reproduce the existent mentality for its own purposes. It need not induce a change, and the compulsive repetition which is one of its foremost characteristics will be at one with the necessity for this continuous reproduction. It relies absolutely on the total structure as well as on each particular trait of the authoritarian character which is itself the product of an internalization of the irrational aspects of modern society. Under the prevailing conditions, the irrationality of fascist propaganda becomes rational in the sense of instinctual economy, for if the status quo is taken for granted and petrified, a much greater effort is needed to see through it than to adjust to it and to obtain at least some gratification through identification with the existent, the focal point of fascist propaganda. This may explain why ultra-reactionary mass movements use the psychology of the masses to a much greater extent than do movements which show more faith in the masses. However, there is no doubt that even the most progressive political movement can deteriorate to the level of the psychology of the crowd and its manipulation, if its own rational content is shattered through the reversion to blind power. The so-called psychology of fascism is largely engendered by manipulation. Rationally calculated techniques bring about what is naively regarded as the natural irrationality of masses. This insight may help us to solve the problem of whether fascism as a mass phenomenon can be explained at all in psychological terms. While there certainly exists potential susceptibility for fascism among the masses, it is equally certain that the manipulation of the unconscious, the kind of suggestion explained by Freud in genetic terms, is indispensable for actualization of this potential. This, however, corroborates the assumption that fascism as such is not a psychological issue and that any attempt to understand its roots and its historical role in psychological terms still remains on the level of ideologies such as the one of irrational forces promoted by fascism itself. Although the fascist, Freudian theory 51, agitator doubtlessly takes up certain tendencies within those he addresses, he does so as the mandatory of powerful economic and political interests. Psychological dispositions do not actually cause fascism. Rather, fascism defines a psychological area which can be successfully exploited by the forces which promote it for entirely non-psychological reasons of self-interest. What happens when masses are caught by fascist propaganda is not a spontaneous primary expression of instincts and urges but a quasi-scientific revitalization of their psychology, the artificial regression described by Freud in his discourse, Sign of Organized Groups. The psychology of the masses has been taken over by their leaders and transformed into a means for their domination. It does not express itself directly through mass movements. This phenomenon is not entirely new but was foreshadowed throughout the counter-revolutionary movements of history. Far from being the source of fascism, psychology has become one element among others in a superimposed system the very totality of which is necessitated by the potential mass of resistance the mass's own rationality. The content of Freud's theory, the replacement of individual narcissism by identification with leader images, points in the direction of what might be called the appropriation of mass psychology by the oppressors. To be sure, this process has a psychological dimension, but it also indicates a growing tendency towards the abolition of psychological motivation in the old, liberalistic sense. Such motivation is systematic, ally controlled and absorbed by social mechanisms which are directed from above. When the leaders become conscious of mass psychology and take it into their own hands, it ceases to exist in a certain sense. This potentiality is contained in the basic construct of psychoanalysis inasmuch as for Freud the concept of psychology is essentially a negative one. He defines the realm of psychology by the supremacy of the unconscious and postulates that what is I should become ego. The emancipation of man from the heteronomous rule of his unconscious would be tantamount to the abolition of his psychology. Fascism furthers this abolition in the opposite sense through the perpetuation of dependence instead of the realization of potential freedom, through expropriation of the unconscious by social control instead of making the subjects conscious of their unconscious. 4. While psychology always denotes some bondage of the individual, it also presupposes 152 the culture industry, freedom in the sense of a certain self-sufficiency and autonomy of the individual. It is not accidental that the 19th century was the great era of psychological thought, in a thoroughly reified society, in which there are virtually no direct relationships between men, and in which each person has been reduced to a social atom, to a mere function of collectivity. The psychological processes, though they still persist in each individual, have ceased to appear as the determining forces of the social process. Thus, the psychology of the individual has lost what Hegel would have called substance. It is perhaps the greatest merit of Freud's book that though he restricted himself to the field of individual psychology and wisely abstained from introducing sociological factors from outside, he nevertheless reached the turning point where psychology abdicates. The psychological impoverishment of the subject that surrendered itself to the object which it has substituted for its most important constituent, that is, the superego, anticipates almost with clairvoyance the post-psychological individualized social atoms which form the fascist collectivities. In these social atoms the psychological dynamic of group formation have overreached themselves and are no longer a reality. The category of phoniness applies to the leaders as well as to the act of identification on the part of the says and their supposed frenzy and hysteria. Just as little as people believe in the depth of their hearts that Jews are the devil, do they completely believe in their leader. They do not really identify themselves with him but act this identification, perform their own enthusiasm, and thus participate in their leader's performance. It is through this performance that they strike a balance between their continuously mobilized instinctual urges and the historical stage of enlightenment they have reached, and which cannot be revoked arbitrarily. It is probably the suspicion of this fictitiousness of their own group psychology which makes fascist crowds so merciless and unapproachable. If they would stop to reason for a second, the whole performance would go to pieces, and they would be left to panic. Freud came upon this element of phoniness within an unexpected context, namely, when he discussed hypnosis as a retrogression of individuals to the relation between primal horde and primal father. As we know from other reactions, individuals have preserved a Freudian theory 153 variable degree of personal aptitude for reviving old situations of this kind. Some knowledge that in spite of everything hypnosis is only a game, a deceptive renewal of these old impressions, may however remain behind and take care that there is a resistance against any too serious consequences of the suspension of the will in hypnosis. 38. In the meantime, this game has been socialized, and the consequences have proved to be very serious. Freud made a distinction between hypnosis and group psychology by defining the former as taking place between two people only. However, the leaders' appropriation of mass psychology, the streamlining of their technique, has enabled them to collectivize the hypnotic spell. The Nazi battle cry of Germany Awake hides its very opposite. The collectivization and institutionalization of the spell, on the other hand, have made the transference more and more indirect and precarious so that the aspect of performance, the phoniness of enthusiastic identification and of all the traditional dynamics of group psychology, have tremendously increased. This increase may well terminate in sudden awareness of the untruth of the spell, and eventually in its collapse. Socialized hypnosis breeds within itself the forces which will do away with the spook of regression through remote control, and in the end awaken those who keep their eyes shut though they are no longer asleep. Notes 1. This chapter forms part of the author's continuing T54 The Culture Industry, Freudian Theory 155, T56 The Culture, Freudian Theory 157, 35 Ibid, page 87, 36 cf. Prophets of Deceit 37 Freud, Ibid, page 76, 38, Ibid, page 99. 6. How to look at television. The effect of television cannot be adequately expressed in terms of success or failure, likes or dislikes, approval or disapproval. Rather, an attempt should be made, with the aid of depth psychological categories and previous knowledge of mass media, to crystallize a number of theoretical concepts by which the potential effect of television, its impact upon various layers of the spectator's personality studied. It seems timely to investigate systematically socio-psychological stimuli typical of televised material both on a descriptive and psychodynamic level, to analyze their presuppositions presuppositions as well as their total pattern, and to evaluate the effect they are likely to produce. This procedure may ultimately bring forth a number of recommendations on how to deal with these stimuli to produce the most desirable effect of television. By exposing the socio-psychological implications and mechanisms of television, which often operate under the guise of false realism, not only may the shows be improved, but, more important possibly, the public at large may be sensitized to the nefarious effect of some of these mechanisms. Could be. We are not concerned with the effectiveness of any particular show or program, but we are concerned with the nature of present-day television and its imagery. Yet, our approach is practical. The findings should be so close to the material, should rest on such a solid, how to look at television T59, foundation of experience, that they can be translated into precise recommendations and be made convincingly clear to large audiences. Improvement of television is not conceived primarily on an artistic, purely aesthetic level, extraneous to present customs. This does not mean that we naively take for granted the dichotomy between autonomous art and mass media. We all know that their relationship is highly complex. Today's rigid division between what is called long-haired and short-haired art is the product of a long historical development. It would be romanticizing to assume that formerly art was entirely pure, that the creative artist thought only in terms of the inner consistency of the artifact and not also of its effect upon the spectators. Theatrical art, in particular, cannot be separated from audience reaction. Conversely, vestiges of the aesthetic claim to be something autonomous, a world unto itself, remain even within the most trivial product of mass culture. In fact, the present rigid division of art into autonomous and commercial aspects is itself largely a function of commercialization. It was hardly accidental that the slogan l'art pour l'art was coined polemically in the Paris of the first half of the 19th century, when literature really became large-scale business for the first time. Many of the cultural products bearing the anti-commercial trademark art for art's sake showed traces of commercialism in their appeal to the sensational or in the conspicuous display of material wealth and sensuous stimuli at the expense of the meaningfulness of the work. This trend was pronounced in the neo-romantic theater of the first decades of our century. Older and recent popular culture, in order to do justice to all such complexities, much closer scrutiny of the background and development of modern mass media is required than communications research, generally limited to present conditions, is aware of. One would have to establish what the output of contemporary cultural industry has in common with older low or popular forms of art as well as with autonomous art, and where the differences lie. Suffice it here to state that the archetypes of present popular culture were set comparatively early in the development of middle-class society, at about the turn of the 17th and the T60 the culture industry, beginning of the 19th centuries in England. According to the studies of the English sociologist Ian Watt, the English novels of that period, particularly the works of Defoe and Richardson, marked the beginning of an approach to literary production that consciously created, surveyed, and finally controlled a market. Today the commercial production of cultural goods has become streamlined, and the impact of popular culture upon the individual has concomitantly increased. This process has not been confined to quantity, but has resulted in new qualities. While recent popular culture has absorbed all the elements and particularly all the dons of its predecessor, it differs decisively inasmuch as it has developed into a system. Thus, popular culture is no longer confined to certain forms such as novels or dance music, but has seized all media of artistic expression. The structure and meaning of these forms show an amazing parallelism, even when they appear to have little in common on the surface, such as jazz and the detective novel. Their output has increased to such an extent that it is almost impossible for anyone to dodge them, and even those formerly aloof from popular culture, the rural population on one hand and the highly educated on the other, are somehow affected. The more the system of merchandising culture is expanded, the more it tends also to assimilate the serious art of the past by adapting this art to the system's own requirements. The control is so extensive that any infraction of its rules is a priori stigmatized as highbrow and has but little chance to reach the population at large. The system's concerted effort results in what might be called the prevailing ideology of our time. Certainly, there are many typical changes within today's pattern. For example, men were formerly presented as erotically aggressive and women on the defensive, whereas this has been largely reversed in modern mass culture, as pointed out particularly by Wolfenstein and Leitz. More important, however, is that the pattern itself, dimly perceptible in the early novels and basically preserved today, has by now become congealed and standardized. Above all, this rigid institutionalization transforms modern mass culture into a medium of undreamed psychological control. The repetitiveness, the self-sameness, and the ubiquity of modern mass culture tend to make for automatized reactions and to weaken the forces of individual resistance. When the journalist Defoe and the printer Richardson calculated the how to look at television L6 effect of their wares upon the audience, they had to speculate, to follow hunches, and therewith, a certain latitude to develop deviations remained. Such deviations have nowadays been reduced to a kind of multiple choice between very few alternatives. The following may serve as an illustration. The popular or semi-popular novels of the first half of the 19th century, published in large quantities and serving mass consumption, were supposed to arouse tension in the reader. Although the victory of the good over the bad was generally provided for, the meandering and endless plots and subplots hardly allowed the readers of Sue and Duma to be continuously aware of the moral. Readers could expect anything to happen. This no longer holds true. Every spectator of a television mystery knows with absolute certainty how it is going to end. Tension is but superficially maintained and is unlikely to have a serious effect anymore. On the contrary, the spectator feels on safe ground all the time. This longing for feeling on safe ground reflecting an infantile need for protection, rather than the desire for a thrill is catered to. The element of excitement is preserved only with tongue-in-cheek. Such changes fall in line with the potential change from a freely competitive to a virtually closed society into which one wants to be admitted or from which one fears to be rejected. Everything somehow appears predestined. The increasing strength of modern mass culture is further enhanced by changes in the sociological structure of the audience. The old cultured elite does not exist anymore. The modern intelligentsia only partially corresponds to it. At the same time, huge strata of the population formerly unacquainted with art have become cultural consumers. Modern audiences, although less capable of the artistic sublimation bred by tradition, have become shrewder in their demands for perfection of technique and for reliability of information, as well as in their desire for services, and they have become more convinced of the consumer's potential power over the producer, no matter whether this power is actually wielded. How changes within the audience have affected the meaning of popular culture may also be illustrated. The element of internalization played a decisive role in early Puritan novels of the Richardson type. This element no longer prevails, for it was based on the essential role of inwardness in both original Protestantism and earlier middle class. T62 The culture industry, society. As the profound influence of the basic tenets of Protestantism has gradually receded, the cultural pattern has become more and more opposed to the introvert, as Reisman puts it. The conformity of earlier generations of Americans of the type I term inner directed was mainly assured by their internalization of adult authority. The middle-class urban American of today, the other directed, is, by contrast, in a characterological sense more the product of his peers, it is in sociological terms, his peer groups, the other kids at school or in the block. This is reflected by popular culture, the accent on inwardness, inner conflicts, and psychological ambivalence, which plays so large a role in earlier popular novels and on which their originality rests, have given way to unproblematic, like characterization. Yet the code of decency that governed the inner conflicts of the Pamelas, Clarissas and Lovelaces remains almost literally intact. The middle-class ontology is preserved in an almost fossilized way, but is severed from the mentality of the middle classes, by being superimposed on people with whose living conditions and mental makeup it is no longer in accord. This middle-class ontology assumes an increasingly authoritarian and at the same time hollow character. The overt naivete of older popular culture is avoided. Mass culture, if not sophisticated, must at least be up to date, that is to say, realistic, or posing as realistic, in order to meet the expectations of a supposedly disillusioned, alert, and hard-boiled audience. Middle-class requirements bound up with internalization, such as concentration, intellectual effort, and erudition, have to be continuously lowered. This does not hold only for the United States, where historical memories are scarcer than in Europe, but it is universal, applying to England and continental Europe as well. However, this apparent progressive enlightenment is more than counterbalanced by retrogressive traits. The earlier popular culture maintained a certain equilibrium between its social ideology and the actual social conditions under which its consumers lived. This probably helped to keep the borderline between popular and serious art during the 18th century more fluid than it is today. Abbe Prévost, How to Look at Television T63, was one of the founding fathers of French popular literature, but his Manon Lescaut is completely free from sitges, artistic vulgarisms, and calculated effects. Similarly, later in the 18th century, Mozart's Zauberflöte struck a balance between the high and the popular style which is almost unthinkable today. The curse of modern mass culture seems to be its adherence to the almost unchanged ideology of early middle-class society, whereas the lives of its consumers are completely out of phase with this ideology. This is probably the reason for the gap between the overt and the hidden message of modern popular art. Although on an overt level the traditional values of English Puritan middle-class society are promulgated, the hidden message aims at a frame of mind which is no longer bound by these values. Rather, today's frame of mind transforms the traditional values into the norms of an increasingly hierarchical and authoritarian social structure. Even here it has to be admitted that authoritarian elements were also present in the older ideology which, of course, never fully expressed the truth, but the message of a just meant and unreflecting obedience seems to be dominant and all-pervasive today. Whether maintained values derived from religious ideas obtain a different meaning when severed from their root should be carefully examined. For example, the concept of the purity of women is one of the invariables of popular culture. In the earlier phase this concept is treated in terms of an inner conflict between concupiscence and the internalized Christian ideal of chastity, whereas in today's popular culture it is dogmatically posited as a value per se. Again, even the rudiments of this pattern are visible in productions such as Pamela. There, however, it seems a byproduct, whereas in today's popular culture the idea that only the nice girl gets married, and that she must get married at any price has come to be accepted. Before Richardson's conflicts even start, the more inarticulate and diffuse the audience of modern mass media seems to be, the more mass media tend to achieve their integrity on. The ideals of conformity and conventionalism were inherent in popular novels from the very beginning now. However, these ideals have been translated into rather clear-cut prescriptions of what to do and what not to do. The outcome of conflicts is pre-established, and all conflicts are mere sham. Society is always the winner, and the T64 the culture industry, individual is only a puppet manipulated through social rules. True, conflicts of the 19th century type, such as women running away from their husbands, the drabness of provincial life, and daily chores, occur frequently in today's magazine stories. However, with a regularity which challenges quantitative treatment, these conflicts are decided in favor of the very same conditions from which these women want to break away. The stories teach their readers that one has to be realistic, that one has to give up romantic ideas, that one has to adjust oneself at any price, and that nothing more can be expected of any individual. The perennial middle-class conflicts between individuality and society has been reduced to a dim memory, and the message is invariably that of identification with the status quo. This theme too is not new, but its unfailing universality invests it with an entirely different meaning. The constant plugging of conventional values seems to mean that these values have lost their substance, and that it is feared that people would really follow their instinctual urges and conscious insights unless continuously reassured from outside that they must not do so. The less the message is really believed and the less it is in harmony with the actual existence of the spectators, the more categorically it is maintained in modern culture. One may speculate whether its inevitable hypocrisy is concomitant with punitiveness and sadistic sternness. Multilayered structure. A depth psychological approach to television has to be focused on its multilayered structure. Mass media are not simply the sum total of the actions they portray or of the messages that radiate from these actions. Mass media also consist of various layers of meaning superimposed on one another, all of which contribute to the effect. True, due to their calculative nature, these rationalized products seem to be more clear-cut in their meaning than authentic works of art, which can never be boiled down to some unmistakable unmistakable message, but the heritage of polymorphic meaning has been taken over by cultural industry inasmuch as what it conveys becomes itself organized in order to enthrall the spectators on various psychological levels simultaneously. As a matter of fact, the hidden message may be more important than the overt. How to look at television T65. Since this hidden message will escape the controls of consciousness, will not be looked through, will not be warded off by sales resistance, but is likely to sink into the spectator's mind. Probably all the various levels in mass media involve all the mechanisms of consciousness and unconsciousness stressed by psycho analysis. The difference between the surface content, the overt message of televised material, and its hidden meaning is generally marked and rather clear-cut. The rigid superimposition of various layers probably is one of the features by which mass media are distinguishable from the integrated products of autonomous art, where the various layers are much more thoroughly fused. The full effect of the material on the spectator cannot be studied without consideration of the hidden meaning in conjunction with the overt one, and it is precisely this interplay of various layers which has hitherto been neglected and which will be our focus. This is in accordance with the assumption shared by numerous social scientists that certain political and social trends of our time, particularly those of a totalitarian nature, feed to a considerable extent on irrational and frequently unconscious motivations. Whether the conscious or the unconscious message of our material is more important is hard to predict and can be evaluated only after careful analysis. We do appreciate, however, that the overt message can be interpreted much more adequately in the light of psychodynamics, that is, in its relation to instinctual urges as well as control, than by looking at the overt in a naive way and by ignoring its implications and presuppositions. The relation between overt and hidden message will prove highly complex in practice. Thus, the hidden message frequently aims at reinforcing conventionally rigid and pseudo-realistic attitudes similar to the accepted ideas more rationalistically propagated by the surface message. Conversely, a number of repressed gratifications which play a large role on the hidden level are somehow allowed to manifest themselves on the surface in jests, off-color remarks, suggestive situations, and similar devices. All this interaction of various levels, however, points in some definite direction, the tendency to channelize audience reaction. This falls in line with the suspicion widely shared, though hard to corroborate by exact data, that the majority of television shows today aim at producing, or at least reproducing, the very smugness, T66 the culture industry, intellectual passivity and gullibility that seem to fit in with totalitarian creeds even if the explicit surface message of the shows may be anti-totalitarian. With the means of modern psychology, we will try to determine the primary prerequisites of shows eliciting mature, adult, and responsible reactions, implying not only in content but in the very way things are being looked at, the idea of autonomous individuals in a free democratic society. We perfectly realize that any definition of such an individual will be hazardous, but we know quite well what a human being, deserving of the appellation autonomous individual, should not be, and this not is actually the focal point of our consideration. When we speak of the multilayered structure of television shows, we are thinking of various superimposed layers of different degrees of manifestness or hiddenness that are utilized by mass culture as a technological means of handling the audience. This was expressed felicitatiously by Leo Lowenthal when he coined the term psychoanalysis in reverse. The implication is that somehow the psychoanalytic concept of a multilayered personality has been taken up by cultural industry, and that the concept is used in order to ensnare the consumer as completely as possible and in order to engage him psychodynamically in the service of premeditated effects. A clear-cut division into allowed gratifications, forbidden gratifications, and recurrence of the forbidden gratifications in a somewhat modified and deflected form is carried through, to illustrate the concept of the multilayered structure. The heroine of an extremely light comedy of pranks is a young schoolteacher who is not only underpaid but is incessantly fined by the caricature of a pompous and authoritarian school principal. Thus, she has no money for her meals and is actually starving. The supposedly funny situations consist mostly of her trying to hustle a meal from various acquaintances, but regularly without success. The mention of food and eating seems to induce laughter, an observation that can frequently be made and invites a study of its own. Overtly, the play is just slight amusement mainly provided by the painful situations into which the heroine and her arch-opponent constantly run. The script does not try to sell any idea. The hidden meaning emerges simply by the way the story looks at human beings. Thus the audience is invited to look at the how to look at television T6 characters in the same way without being made up where that indoctrination is present. The character of the underpaid, maltreated schoolteacher is an attempt to reach a compromise between prevailing scorn for the intellectual and the equally conventionalized respect for culture. The heroine shows such an intellectual superiority and high-spiritedness that identification with her is invited, and compensation is offered for the inferiority of her position and that of her ilk in the social setup. Not only is the central character supposed to be very charming, but she wisecracks constantly. In terms of a said pattern of identification, the script implies, if you are as humorous, good-natured, quick-witted, and charming as she is, do not worry about being paid a starvation wage. You can cope with your frustration in a humorous way, and your superior wit and cleverness put you not only above material privations, but also above the rest of mankind. In other words, the script is a shrewd method of promoting adjustments to humiliating conditions by presenting them as objectively comical and by giving a picture of a person who experiences even her own inadequate position as an object of fun apparently free of any resentment. Of course, this latent message cannot be considered as unconscious in the strict psychological sense, but rather as unobtrusive. This message is hidden only by a style which does not pretend to touch anything serious and expects to be regarded as featherweight. Nevertheless, even such amusement tends to set patterns for the members of the audience without their being aware of it. Another comedy of the same thesis is reminiscent of The Funnies. A cranky old woman sets up the will of her cat Mr. Casey, and makes us as some of the schoolteachers in the permanent cast. Later the actual inheritance is found to consist of a cat's valueless toys. The plot is so constructed that each heir, at the reading of the will, is tempted to act as if he had known this person Mr. Casey. The ultimate point is that the cat's owner had placed $100 pill inside each of the toys, and the heirs run to the incinerator to recover their inheritance. The audience is given to understand, don't expect the impossible, don't daydream, but be realistic. The denunciation of that archetypal daydream is enhanced by the association of the wish for unexpected and irrational blessings with dishonesty, hypocrisy, and a generally, T68 the culture industry, undignified attitude. The spectator is given to understand, those who dare daydream, who expect that money will fall to them from heaven, and who forget any caution about accepting an absurd will are at the same time those whom you might expect to be capable of cheating. Here, an objection may be raised, is such a sinister effect of a hidden message of television known to those who control, plan, write, and direct shows? Or it may even be asked, are those traits possible, projections of the unconscious of the decision makers' own minds, according to the widespread assumption that works of art can be properly understood in terms of psychological projections of their authors? As a matter of fact, it is this kind of reasoning that has led to the suggestion that a special socio-psychological study of decision makers in the field of television be made. We do not think that such a study will lead us very far. Even in the sphere of autonomous art, the idea of projection has been largely overrated. Although the author's motive, actions certainly enter the artifact, they are by no means so all-determining as is often assumed. As soon as an artist has set himself his problem, it obtains some kind of impact of its own, and, in most cases, he has to follow the objective requirements of his product much more than his own urges of expression when he translates his primary conception into reality. To be sure, these objective requirements do not play a decisive role in mass media, which stress the effects on the spectator far beyond any artistic problem. However, the total setup here tends to limit the chances of the artist's projections utterly. Those who produce the material follow, often grumblingly, innumerable requirements, rules of thumb, set patterns, and mechanisms of control, which by necessity reduce to a minimum the range of any kind of artistic self-expression. The fact that most products of mass media are not produced by one individual but by collective collaboration, as happens to be true with most of the illustrations so far discussed, is only one contributing factor to this generally prevailing condition. To study television shows in terms of the psychology of the authors would almost be tantamount to studying Ford cars in terms of the psychoanalysis of the late Mr. Ford. How to look at television T69. Presumptuousness. The typical psychological mechanisms utilized by television shows and the devices by which they are automatized function only within a small number of given frames of reference operative in television community, Catan, and the socio-psychological effect largely depends on them. We are all familiar with the division of television content into various classes, such as light comedy, westerns, mysteries, so-called sophisticated plays, and others. These types have developed into formulas, which, to a certain degree, pre-establish the attitudinal pattern of a spectator before he is confronted with any specific content and which largely determine the way in which any specific content is being perceived. In order to understand television, it is, therefore, not enough to bring out the implications of various shows and types of shows, but an examination must be made of the presuppositions within which the implications function before a single word is spoken. Most important is that the typing of shows has gone so far that the spectator approaches each one with a set pattern of expectations before he faces the show itself. Just as the radio listener who catches the beginning of Tchaikovsky's piano concerto as a theme song knows automatically, aha, serious music, or, when he hears organ music, responds equally automatically, aha, religion. These halo effects of previous experiences may be psychologically as important as the implications of the phenomena themselves for which they have set the stage, and these presuppositions should, therefore, be treated with equal care. When a television show bears the title Dante's Inferno, when the first shot is out of a nightclub by the same name, and when we find sitting at the bar a man with his hat on and at some distance from Hina sad-looking, heavily made up woman ordering another drink, we are almost certain that some murder will surely be committed. The apparently individualized situation actually works only as a signal that moves our expectations into a definite direction. If we had never seen anything but Dante's Inferno, we probably would not be sure about what was going to happen. But, as it is, we are actually given to understand by both subtle and not so subtle devices that this is a crime play, that we are entitled to expect some sinister and probably hideous and the culture industry, sadistic deeds of violence, that the hero will be saved from a situation from which he can hardly be expected to be saved, that the woman on the bar stool is probably not the main criminal but is likely to lose her life as a gangster's mole, and so on. This conditioning to such universal patterns, however, scarcely stops at the television set. The way the spectator is made to look at apparently everyday items, such as a nightclub, and to take as hints of possible crime common settings of his daily life, induces him to look at life itself as though it and its conflicts could generally be understood in such terms. Degrees this, convincingly enough, may be the nucleus of truth in the old-fashioned arguments against all kinds of mass media for inciting criminality in the audience. The decisive thing is that this atmosphere of the normality of crime, its presentation in terms of an average expectation based on life situations, is never expressed in so many words but is established by the overwhelming wealth of material. It may affect certain spectator groups more deeply than the overt moral of crime and punishment regularly derived from such shows. What matters is not the importance of crime as a symbolic expression of otherwise uncontrolled sexual or aggressive impulses, but the confusion of this symbolism with a pedantically maintained realism in all matters of direct sense perception. Thus, empirical life becomes infused with a kind of meaning that virtually excudes adequate experience no matter how obstinately the veneer of such realism is built up. This affects the social and psychological function of drama. It is hard to establish whether the spectators of Greek tragedy really experienced the catharsis Aristotle described. In fact, this theory, evolved after the age of tragedy was over, seems to have been a rationalization itself, an attempt to state the purpose of tragedy in pragmatic, quasi-scientific terms. Whatever the case, it seems pretty certain that those who saw the Aurus Chiller of Aeschylus or Sophocles' Oedipus were not likely to translate these tragedies, the subject matter of which was known to everyone, and the interest in which was centered in artistic treatment directly into everyday terms. This audience did not expect that on the next corner of Athens similar things would go on. Actually, pseudo-realism allows for the direct and extremely primitive identification achieved by popular culture, and in presence of facade trivial buildings, rooms, dresses and faces as though they were the how to look at television T/1 promise of something thrilling and exciting taking place at any moment. In order to establish this socio-psychological frame of reference, one would have to follow up systematically categories such as the normality of crime or pseudo-realism and many others, to determine their structural unity and to interpret the specific devices, symbols, and stereotypes in relation to this frame of reference. We hypothesize at this phase that the frames of reference and the individual devices will tend in the same direction, only against psychological backdrops such as pseudo-realism and against implicit assumptions such as the normality of crime can the specific stereotypes of television plays be interpreted. The very standardization indicated by set frames of reference automatically produces a number of stereotypes. Also, the technology of television production makes stereotyping almost inevitable. The short time available for the preparation of scripts and the vast material continuously to be produced call for certain formulas. Moreover, in plays lasting only a quarter to half an hour each, it appears inevitable that the kind of person the audience faces each time should be indicated drastically through red and green lights. We are not dealing with the problem of the existence of stereotypes as such, since stereotypes are an indispensable element of the organization and anticipation of experience, preventing us from falling into mental disorganization and chaos. No art can entirely dispense with them. Again, the functional change is what concerns us. The more stereotypes become reified and rigid in the present setup of cultural industry, the more people are tempted to cling desperately to cliches which seem to bring some order into the otherwise ununderstandable. Thus, people may not only lose true insight into reality, but ultimately their very capacity for life experience may be dulled by the constant wearing of blue and pink spectacles. Stereotyping. In coping with this danger, we may not do full justice to the meaning of some of the stereotypes which are to be dealt with. We should never forget that there are two sides to every psychodynamic phenomenon, the unconscious or id element and the rationalization. Although to the culture industry, latter is psychologically defined as a defense mechanism, it may very well contain some non-psychological, objective truth which cannot simply be pushed aside on account of the psychological function of the rationalization. Thus some of the stereotypical messages, directed toward particularly weak spots in the mentality of large sectors of the population, may prove to be quite legitimate. However, it may be said with fairness that the questionable blessings of morals, such as one should not chase after rainbows, are largely overshadowed by the threat of inducing people to mechanical simplifications by distorting the world in such a way that it seems to fit into pre-established pigeonholes. The example here selected, however, should indicate rather drastic, allied danger of stereotyping. A television play concerning a fascist dictator, a kind of hybrid between Mussolini and Peron, shows a dictator in a moment of crisis, and the content of the play is his inner and outer collapse. Whether the cause of his collapse is a popular upheaval or a military revolt is never made clear, but neither this issue nor any other of a social or political nature enters the plot itself. The course of events takes place exclusively on a private level. The dictator is just a heel who treats sadistically both his secretary and his lovely and warm-hearted wife. His antagonist, a general, was formerly in love with the wife, and they both still love each other, although the wife sticks loyally to her husband. Forced by her husband's brutality, she attempts flight, and is intercepted by the general who wants to save her. The turning point occurs when the guards surround the palace to defend the dictator's popular wife. As soon as they learn that she has departed, the guards quit, and the dictator, whose inflated ego explodes at the same time, gives up. The dictator is nothing but a bad, pompous and cowardly man. He seems to act with extreme stupidity. Nothing of the objective dynamics of dictatorship comes out. The impression is created that totalitarianism grows out of character disorders of ambitious politicians, and is overthrown by the honesty, courage, and warmth of those figures with whom the audience is supposed to identify. The standard device employed is that of the spurious personalization of objective issues. The representatives of ideas under attack, as in the case of the fascists here, are presented as villains in a ludicrous cloak and dagger fashion, whereas those who, how to look at television T73, fight for the right cause are personally idealized. This not only distracts from many real social issues but also enforces the psychologically extremely dangerous division of the world into black, the out group, and white, we, the in group. Certainly, no artistic production can deal with ideas or political creeds in abstracto but has to present them in terms of their concrete impact upon human beings. Yet it would be utterly futile to present individuals as mere specimens of an abstraction, as puppets expressive of an idea, in order to deal with the concrete impact of totalitarian systems. It would be more commendable to show how the life of ordinary people is affected by terror and impotence than to cope with the phony psychology of the big shots, whose heroic role is silently endorsed by such a treatment even if they are pictured as villains. There seems to be hardly any question of the importance of an analysis of pseudo-personalization and its effect, by no means limited to television. Although pseudo-personalization denotes the stereotyped way of looking at things in television, we should also point out certain stereotypes in the narrower sense. Many television plays could be characterized by the sobriquet pretty girl can do no wrong. The heroine of a light comedy is, to use George Legman's term, a bitch heroine. She behaves toward her father in an incredibly inhuman and cruel manner only slightly rationalized as merry pranks, but she is punished very slightly, if at all. True, in real life bad deeds are rarely punished at all, but this cannot be applied to television. Here, those who have developed the production code for the movies seem right. What matters in mass media is not what happens in real life, but rather the positive and negative messages, prescriptions, and taboos that the spectator absorbs by means of identification with the material he is looking at. The punishment given to the pretty heroine only nominally fulfills the conventional requirements of the conscience for a second, but the spectator is given to understand that the pretty heroine really gets away with everything just because she is pretty. The attitude in question seems to be indicative of a universal penchant. In another sketch that belongs to a series dealing with the confidence racket, the attractive girl who is an active participant in the racket not only is paroled after having been sentenced to a long term, but also seems to have a good chance of marrying her victim. Her sex, 74 the culture industry, morality, of course, is unimpeachable. The spectator is supposed to like her at first sight as a modest and self-effacing character, and he must not be disappointed. Although it is discovered that she is a crook, the original identification must be restored, or rather maintained. The stereotype stereotype of the nice girl is so strong that not even the proof of her delinquency can destroy it, and, by hook or by crook, she must be what she appears to be. It goes without saying that such psychological models tend to confirm exploitative, demanding, and aggressive attitudes on the part of young girls, a character structure which has come to be known in psychoanalysis under the name of oral aggressiveness. Sometimes such stereotypes are disguised as national American traits, a part of the American scene where the image of the haughty, egoistic, yet irresistible girl who plays havoc with poor dad has come to be a public institution. This way of reasoning is an insult to the American spirit. High-pressure publicity and continuous plugging to institutionalize some obnoxious type does not make the type a sacred symbol of folklore. Many considerations of an apparently anthropo-logical nature today tend only to veil objectionable trends, as though they were of an ethnological, quasi-natural character. Incidentally, it is amazing to what degree television material even on superficial examination brings to mind psychoanalytic concepts with the qualification of being a psychoanalysis in reverse. Psychoanalysis has described the oral syndrome combining the antagonistic trends of aggressive and dependent traits. This character syndrome is closely indicated by the pretty girl that can do no wrong, who, while being aggressive against her father, exploits him at the same time, depending on him as much as, on the surface level, she is set against him. The difference between the sketch and psychoanalysis is simply that the sketch exalts the very same syndrome which is treated by psychoanalysis as a reversion to infantile developmental phases and which the psychoanalyst tries to dissolve. It remains to be seen whether something similar applies as well to some types of male heroes, particularly the superhuman. It may well be that he too can do no wrong. Finally, we should deal with a rather widespread stereotype which, inasmuch as it is taken for granted by television, is further enhanced. At the same time, the example may serve to show that certain psychoanalytic interpretations of cultural stereotypes are not really too how to look at television t/5 far-fetched. The latent ideas that psychoanalysis attributes to certain stereotypes come to the surface. There is the extremely popular idea that the artist is not only maladjusted, introverted and a priori somewhat funny, but that he is really an aesthete, a weakling, and a sissy. In other words, modern synthetic folklore tends to identify the artist with the homosexual and to respect only the man of action as a real, strong man. This idea is expressed in a surprisingly direct manner in one of the comedy scripts at our disposal. It portrays a young man who is not only the dope who appears so often on television but is also a shy, retiring, and accordingly untalented poet, whose moronic poems are ridiculed. He is in love with a girl but is too weak and insecure to indulge in the necking practices she rather crudely suggests. The girl, on her part, is caricatured as a boy chaser. As happens frequently in mass culture, the roles of the sexes are reversed. The girl is utterly aggressive and the boy, utterly afraid of her, describes himself as woman-handled when she manages to kiss him. There are vulgar innuendos of homosexuality of which one may be quoted. The heroine tells her boyfriend that another boy is in love with someone, and the boyfriend asks, "What's he in love with?" She answers, "A girl, of course," and her boyfriend replies, "Why, of course? Once before it was a neighbor's turtle, and what's more its name was Sam." This interpretation of the artist as innately incompetent and a social outcast, by the innuendo of sexual inversion, is worthy of examination. We do not pretend that the individual illustrations and examples, or the theories by which they are interpreted, are basically new, but in view of the cultural and pedagogical problem presented by television, we do not think that the novelty of the specific findings should be a primary concern. We know from psychoanalysis that the reasoning, but we know all this is often a defense. This defense is made in order to dismiss insights as irrelevant because they are actually uncomfortable and make life more difficult for us than it already is by shaking our conscience when we are supposed to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The investigation of the television problems we have here indicated and illustrated by a few examples selected at random demands, most of all, taking seriously notions dimly familiar to most of us by putting them into their proper context and perspective and by checking them by pertinent material. We propose to concentrate on issues of 6. The culture industry, which we are vaguely but uncomfortably aware, even of the expense or discomforts mounting, the further and the more systematically our studies proceed. The effort here required is of a moral nature itself, knowingly to face psychological mechanisms operating on various levels in order not to become blind and passive victims. We can change this medium of far-reaching potentialities only if we look at it in the same spirit which we hope will one day be expressed by its imagery. Notes. 1. David Reisman, The Lonely Crowd, New Haven. How to look at 7. Transparency is on film. Children when teasing each other and their squabbles. Follow the rule. No fair copycat. Their wisdom seems to be lost on the all too thoroughly grown-up adults. The Aberhauseners attack the nearly 60-year-old trash production of the film industry with the epithet Daddy's Cinema. Representatives of the latter in turn could come up with no better retort than Kiddy's Cinema. This cat, as once again the saying goes among children, does not copy. How pathetic to pit experience acquired during the adolescence of the medium. What is repulsive about Daddy's Cinema is its infantile character, regression manufactured on an industrial scale. The sophistry of the defenders insists on the very type of achievement the concept of which is cruel-lenged by the opposition. However, even if there was something to that reproach, if films that did not play along with business really were in some ways clumsier than the latter's smoothly polished wares, then the triumph would be pitiful. It would only demonstrate that those supported by the power of capital, technological routine and highly trained specialists could do better in some respects than those who rebel against the colossus and thus must necessarily to regale the advantages of its accumulated potential. In this comparatively awkward and unprofessional cinema, uncertain of its effects, is inscribed the hope that the so-called mass media might eventually become something. Transparency is on film 9, qualitatively different, while in autonomous art anything lagging behind the already established established technical standard does not rate, vis-a-vis the culture industry whose standard excludes everything but the pre-digested and the already integrated. Just as the cosmetic trade eliminates facial wrinkles, works which have not completely mastered their technique, conveying as a result something consolingly uncontrolled and accidental, have a liberating quality. In them the flaws of a pretty girl's complexion become the corrective to the immaculate face of the professional star. It is known that in the tallest film large segments of Musil's early novel were incorporated into the dialogue almost unchanged. They are considered superior to the lines by the scriptwriters, which no living person would ever utter, and which in the meantime have been ridiculed by American critics. In their own way, however, Musil's sentences also tend to sound artificial as soon as they are heard, not read. This may be to some extent the fault of the novel, which incorporates a type of rationalistic casuistry into the internal movement of its text under the guise of a psychology that the more progressive Freudian psychology of the period exposed as a rationalization. Nevertheless, this is hardly the whole point. The artistic difference between the media is obviously still greater than expected by those who feel able to avoid bad prose by adapting good prose. Even when dialogue is used in a novel, the spoken word is not directly spoken but is rather distanced by the act of narration, perhaps even by the typography, and thereby abstracted from the physical presence of living persons. Thus, fictional characters never resemble their empirical counterparts no matter how minutely they are described. In fact, it may be due to the very precision of their presentation that they are removed even further from empirical reality. They become aesthetically autonomous. Such distance is ablished in film. To the extent that a film is realistic, the semblance of immediacy cannot be avoided. As a result, phrases justified by the diction of narrative which distinguishes them from the false everydayness of mere reportage sound pompous and inauthentic in film. Film, therefore, must search for other means of conveying immediacy. Improvisation which systematically surrenders itself to unguided chance should rank high among possible alternatives. The late emergence of film makes it difficult to distinguish between the culture industry, technique and technology as clearly as is possible in music. In music up to the electronic period, the intrinsic technique, the sound structure of the work, was distinct from its performance, the means of reproduction. Film suggests the equation of technique and technology since, as Benjamin observed, the cinema has no original which is then reproduced on a mass scale. The mass product is the thing itself. This equation, however, is problematic. In film as well as in music, experts in cinematographic techniques refer to the fact that Chaplin was either unaware of or purposely ignored these techniques, being content with a photographic rendering of sketches, slapstick routines or other performances. This in no way lowers Chaplin's status and one can hardly doubt that he was filmic. Nowhere but on the screen could this enigmatic figure, reminiscent of old-fashioned photographs right from the start, have developed its concept. As a consequence, it appears impossible to derive norms of criticism from cinematographic technique as such. The most plausible theory of film technique, that which focuses on the movement of objects, is both provocatively denied and yet preserved, in negative form, in the static character of films like Antonioni's La Notte. Whatever is uncinematic in this film gives it the power to express, as if with hollow eyes, the emptiness of time. Irrespective of the technological origins of the cinema, the aesthetics of film will do better to base itself on a subjective mode of experience which film resembles and which constitutes its artistic character. A person who, after a year in the city, spends a few weeks in the mountains abstaining from all work, may unexpectedly experience colorful images of landscapes consolingly coming over him or her in dreams or daydreams. These images do not merge into one another in a continuous flow, but are rather set off against each other in the course of their appearance. Much like the magic lantern slides of our childhood, it is in the discontinuity of that movement that the images of the interior monologue resemble the phenomenon of writing, the latter similarly moving before our eyes while fixed in its discrete signs. Such movement of interior images may be to film what the visible world is to painting or the acoustic world to music. As the objectivating recollection of this type of experience, film may become art. The technological medium par excellence is thus intimately related to the beauty of nature. Tiefo and dem Naturschen. Transparency is on film L1. If one decides to take the self-censors more or less literally and confront films with the context of their reception, one will have to proceed more subtly than those traditional content analyses which, by necessity, relied primarily on the intentions of a film and neglected the potential gap between such intentions and their actual effect. This gap, however, is inherent in the medium. If according to the analysis of television as ideology film accommodates various layers of behavioral response patterns, this would imply that the ideology provided by the industry, its officially intended models, may by no means automatically correspond to those that affect the spectators. If empirical communications research were finally to look for problems which could lead to some results, this one would merit priority. Overlapping the official models are a number of unofficial ones which supply the attraction yet are intended to be neutralized by the former, in order to capture the consumers and provide them with substitute satisfaction. The unofficial, if you will, heterodox ideology must be depicted in a much broader and juicier fashion than suits the moral of the story. The tabloid newspapers furnish weekly examples of such excess. One would expect the public's libido, repressed by a variety of taboos, to respond all the more promptly since these behavioral patterns, by the very fact that they are allowed to pass, reflect an element of collective approval. While intention is always directed against the playboy, the Dolce Vita and wild parties, the opportunity to behold them seems to be relished more than the hasty verdict. If today you can see in Germany, in Prague, even in conservative Switzerland and in Catholic Rome, everywhere, boys and girls crossing the streets locked in each other's arms and kissing each other unembarrassed, then they have learned this, and probably more, from the films which peddle Parisian libertinages folklore. In its attempt to manipulate the masses, the ideology of the culture industry itself becomes as internally antagonistic as the very society which it aims to control. The ideology of the culture industry contains the antidote to its own lie. No other plea could be made for its defense. The photographic process of film, primarily representational, places a higher intrinsic significance on the object, as foreign to subjectivity, than aesthetically autonomous techniques. This is the retarding aspect of film in the historical process of art. Even where film dissolves and, T82 the culture industry, modifies its objects as much as it can, the disintegration is never complete. Consequently, it does not permit absolute construction. Its elements, however abstract, always retain something representational. They are never purely aesthetic values. Due to this difference, elements, society projects into film quite differently, far more directly on account of the objects, than into advanced painting or literature. That which is irreducible about the objects in FLM is itself a mark of society, prior to the aesthetic realization of an intention. By virtue of this relationship to the object, the aesthetics of film is thus inherently concerned with society. There can be no aesthetics of the cinema, not even a purely technological one, which would not include the sociology of the cinema. Krakauer's theory of FLM, which practices sociological abstention, compels us to consider that which is left out in his book. Otherwise, anti-formalism turns into formalism. Krakauer ironically plays with the resolve of his earliest youth to celebrate film as the discoverer of the beauties of daily life. Such a program, however, was a program of Jugendstil, just as all those films which attempt to let wandering clouds and murky ponds speak for themselves are relics of Jugendstil. By choosing objects presumably cleansed of subjective meaning, these films infuse the object with exactly that meaning which they are trying to resist. Benjamin did not elaborate on how deeply some of the categories he postulated for film, exhibition, test, are imbricated with the commodity character which his theory opposes. The reactionary nature of any realist aesthetic today is inseparable from this commodity character, tending to reinforce, affirmatively, the phenomenal surface of society. Realism dismisses any attempt to penetrate that surface as a romantic endeavor. Every meaning, including critical meaning, which the camera eye imparts to the FLM would already invalidate the law of the camera and thus violate Benjamin's taboo, conceived as it was with the explicit purpose of outdoing the provocative Brecht, and thereby, this may have been its secret purpose, gaining freedom from him. Film is faced with the dilemma of finding a procedure which neither lapses into arts and crafts nor slips into a mere documentary mode. The obvious answer today, as 40 years ago, is that of montage, which does not interfere with things but rather arranges them in a conciliation akin to that of writing the viability of a procedure based on the transparencies on film. T83 principle of shock, however, raises doubts. Pure montage, without the addition of intentionality in its elements, does not derive intention merely from the principle itself. It seems illusory to claim that through the renunciation of all meaning, especially the cinematically inherent renunciation of psychology, meaning will emerge from the reproduced material itself. It may be, however, that the entire issue is rendered obsolete by the insight that the refusal to interpret, to add subjective ingredients, is in itself a subjective act and as such a priori significant. The individual subject who remained silent speaks not less but more through silence than when speaking aloud. Those filmmakers ostracized for being too intellectual should, by way of ready science, absorb this insight into their working methods. Nonetheless, the gap between the most progressive tendencies in the visual arts and those of film continues to exist, compromising the latter's most radical intentions. For the time being, evidently, film's most promising potential lies in its interaction with other media, themselves merging into film, such as certain kinds of music. One of the most powerful examples of such interaction is a television film Antithesis by composer Maurice Okagel, that, among its functions, film provides models for collective behavior is not just an additional imposition of ideology. Such collectivity, rather, is in the innermost element of film. The movements which the film presents are mimetic impulses which, prior to all content and meaning, incite the viewers and listeners to fall into step as if in a parade. In this respect, film resembles music just as, in the early days of radio, music resembled film strips. It would not be incorrect to describe the constitutive subject of film as a we in which the aesthetic and sociological aspects of the medium converge. Anything goes with the title of a film from the 193s with a popular English actress Gracie Fields. This anything captures the very substance of FLM's formal movement, prior to all content. As the eye is carried along, it joins the current of all those who are responding to the same appeal. The indeterminate nature of this collective anything use, however, which is linked to the formal character of film, facilitates the ideological misuse of the medium. The pseudo-revolutionary blurring in which the phrase things must change is conveyed by the gesture of banging one's fist on the table. The liberated film would have to wrest its a priori, T80 for the culture industry, collectivity from the mechanisms of unconscious and irrational influence and enlist this collectivity in the service of emancipatory intentions. Film technology has developed a series of techniques which work against the realism inherent in the photographic process. Among these are soft focus shots, a long outdated arty custom in photography, superimpositions, and also, frequently, flashbacks. It is about time to recognize the ludicrousness of such effects and get rid of them, because these techniques are not grounded in the necessities of individual works but in mere convention. They inform the viewer as to what is being signified or what needs to be added in order to comprehend whatever escapes basic cinematic realism. Since these techniques almost always contain some expressive, even if commonplace values of their own, a discrepancy arises between expression and conventional sign. This is what gives these inserts the appearance of kitsch. Whether it creates the same effect in the context of montage and extradigetic associations has yet to be examined. In any case, such cinematographic divagations require particular tact on the part of the filmmaker. The lesson to be learned from this phenomenon is dialectical. Technology in isolation, which disregards the nature of film as language, may end up in contradiction to its own internal logic. Emancipated film production should no longer depend critically upon technology, that is, the mere equivalent of its profession, in the manner of a by no means still new objectivity. Sine Kineswegs Manuan Saklichkeit. In commercial film production, however, the aesthetic logic inherent in the material is caught in a stage of crisis even before it is given a chance to really unfold. The demand for a meaningful relationship between technique, material and content does not mix well with the fetishism of means. It is undeniable that daddy's cinema indeed corresponds to what the consumers want, or, perhaps, rather that it provides them with an unconscious canon of what they do not want, that is, something different from what they are presently being fed. Otherwise, the culture industry could not have become a mass culture. The identity of these two phenomena, however, is not so beyond doubt as critical thought assumes, as long as it focuses on the aspect of production and refrains from empirical analysis of reception. Nevertheless, the favorite, transparent currency is on film. T85. Argument of the whole and half-hearted apologists that culture industry is the art of a consumer is untrue. It is the ideology of ideology. Even the reductive equation of the culture industry with the low art of all ages does not hold up. The culture industry contains an element of rationality, the calculated reproduction of the low which, while certainly not missing in the low art of the past, was not its rationale. Moreover, the venerable roughness and idiocy of such hybrids of circenses and burlesque so popular during the late Roman Empire do not justify the revival of such phenomena after they have become aesthetic, ally, and socially transparent. Even if considered apart from its historical perspective, the validity of the argument for consumer-oriented art can be attacked in the very present. Its proponents depict the relationship between art and its reception as static and harmonious, according to the principle of supply and demand, in itself a dubious model. Art unrelated to the objective spirit of its time is equally unimaginable as art without the moment which transcends it. The separation from empirical reality which pertains to the constitution of art from the outset requires precisely that moment. The conformity to the consumer, on the contrary, which likes to masquerade as humanitarianism, is nothing but the economic technique of consumer exploitation. Artistically, it means the renunciation of all interference with the CUP substance of the current idiom and, as a result, with the reified consciousness of the audience. By reproducing the latter with hypocritical subservience, the culture industry changes this reified consciousness all the more. That is, for its own purposes, it actually prevents that consciousness from changing on its own, as it secretly and, deep down, unadmittedly desires. The consumers are made to remain what they are, consumers. That is why the culture industry is not the art of the consumer but rather the projection of the will of those in control onto their victims. The automatic self-reproduction of the status quo in its established forms is itself an expression of domination. One will have observed that it is difficult, initially, to distinguish the preview of a coming attraction from the main film for which one is waiting. This may tell us something about the main attractions. Like the previews and like the pop hits, they are advertisements for themselves, bearing the commodity character like a mark of Cain on there. T86 The culture industry, forwards. Every commercial film is actually only the preview of that which it promises and will never deliver. How nice it would be if, under the present circumstances, one could claim that the less films appear to be works of art, the more they would be just that. One is especially drawn to this conclusion in reaction to those snobbish psychological class A pictures which the culture industry forces itself to make for the sake of cultural legitimation. Even so, one must guard against taking such optimism too far. The standardized westerns and thrillers, to say nothing of the products of German humor and the patriotic tearjerkers, Heimatsknalls, are even worse than the official hits. In integrated culture one cannot even depend on the dregs. Notes. 1. Der Junge, a film by Volker Sklundolf, based on Robert Musil. 2. Cf. Siegfried Krackel, The Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality, Die Verwirrung des Zeitlingstollers. Translator's footnote. 3. Antithes, film for one performer with electronic and everyday sounds. First New York, Oxford University Press. Pages 41F broadcast the 1st of April, 1966 by NDR3, Hamburg. Translator's footnote. 4. Anything Goes, 1936. Paramount. Directed by Louis Milestone. With Bing Crosby, Ethel Merman, Grace Bradley, Sick, and others. Songs by Cole Porter. Translator's footnote. 8. Free time. The question concerning free time, what people do with it and what opportunities could eventually evolve from it, must not be posed as an abstract generalization. Incidentally, the expression free time or spare time originated only recently. Its precursor, the term leisure, mus, denoted the privilege of an unconstrained, comfortable lifestyle, hence something qualitatively different and far more auspicious, and it indicates a specific difference, that of time which is neither free nor spare, which is occupied by work, and which moreover one could designate as heteronymous. Free time is shackled to its opposite. Indeed, the oppositional relation in which it stands imbues free time with certain essential characteristics. What is more, and far more importantly, free time depends on the totality of social conditions, which continues to hold people under its spell. Neither in their work nor in their consciousness do people dispose of genuine freedom over themselves. Even those conciliatory sociologies which use the term role as a key recognize this fact, insofar as the term itself, borrowed from the domain of the theater, suggests that the existence foisted upon people by society is identical neither with people as they are in themselves nor with all that they could be. Of course, one should not attempt to make a simple distinction between people as they are in themselves and their so-called social roles. These roles affect the T88 the culture industry, innermost articulation of human characteristics, to such an extent that in the age of truly unparalleled social integration, it is hard to ascertain anything in human beings which is not functionally determined. This is an important consideration for the question of free time. It means to say that even where the hold of the spell is relaxed, and people are at least subjectively convinced that they are acting of their own free will, this will itself is shaped by the very same forces which they are seeking to escape in their hours without work. The question which today would really do justice to the phenomenon of free time would be following: what becomes of free time, where productivity of labor continues to rise, under persisting conditions of unfreedom, that is, under relations of production into which people are born, and which prescribe the rules of human existence today just as they always have done? Free time has already expanded enormously in our day and age, and this expansion should increase still further, due to inventions in the fields of automation and atomic power, which have not yet been anywhere like fully exploited. If one were to try and answer this question without ideological preconceptions, one could not avoid the suspicion that free time is tending toward its own opposite, and is becoming a parody of itself. Thus unfreedom is gradually annexing free time, and the majority of unfree people are as unaware of this process as they are of the unfreedom itself. I should like to elucidate the problem with the help of a trivial experience of my own. Time and time again, when questioned or interviewed, one is asked about one's hobbies. When the illustrated weeklies report on the life of one of those giants of the culture industry, they rarely forego the opportunity to report, with varying degrees of intimacy, on the hobbies of the person in question. I am shocked by the question when I come up against it. I have no hobby. Not that I am the kind of workaholic, who is incapable of doing anything with his time but applying himself industriously to the required task. But, As far as my activities beyond the bounds of my recognized profession are concerned, I take them all, without exception, very seriously. So much so, that I should be horrified by the very idea that they had anything to do with hobbies, preoccupations with which I had become mindlessly infatuated merely in order to kill the time. Had I not become hardened by experience to such examples of this now widespread, free time 89, barbarous mentality, making music, listening to music, reading with all my attention, these activities are part and parcel of my life. To call them hobbies would make a mockery of them. On the other hand, I have been fortunate enough that my job, the production of philosophical and sociological works and university teaching, cannot be defined in terms of that strict opposition to free time, which is demanded by the current razor-sharp division of the two. I am however well aware that in this I enjoy a privilege, with both the element of fortune and of guilt which this involves. I speak as one who has had the rare opportunity to follow the path of his own intentions and to fashion his work accordingly. This is certainly one good reason why there is no hard and fast opposition between my work itself and what I do apart from it. If free time really was to become just that state of affairs in which everyone could enjoy what was once the prerogative of a few, and compared to feudal society, bourgeois society has taken some steps in this direction, then I would picture it after my own experience of life outside work. Although given different conditions, this model would in its turn necessarily alter. If we suppose with Marx that in bourgeois society labor power has become a commodity in which labor is consequently reified, then the expression hobby amounts to a paradox, that human condition which sees itself as the opposite of reification, the oasis of unmediated life within a completely mediated total system, has itself been reified just like the rigid distinction between labor and free time. The latter is a continuation of the forms of profit-oriented social life. Just as the term show business is today taken utterly seriously, the irony in the ex-Bassine leisure industry has now been quite forgotten. It is widely known but no less true therefore that specific leisure activities like tourism and camping revolve around and are organized for the sake of profit. At the same time, the difference between work and free time has been branded as a norm in the minds of people, at both the conscious and the unconscious level, because, in accordance with the predominant work ethic, I'm free of work should be utilized for the recreation of expended labor power, then work less time, precisely because it is a mere appendage of work, is severed from the latter with puritanical zeal. And here we come across a behavioral norm of the bourgeois character. On the one hand, one should pay attention at work and not be 190 the culture industry, distracted or luck about. Wage labor is predicated on this assumption and its laws have been internalized. On the other hand, free time must not resemble work in any way whatsoever, in order, presumably, that one can work all the more effectively afterwards. Hence the inanity of many leisure activities, and yet, in secret as it were, the contraband of modes of behavior proper to the domain of work, which will not let people out of its power, is being smuggled into the realm of free time. In earlier times, children were allotted marks for attentiveness in their school reports. This had its corollary in the subjective, perhaps even well-meaning worries of adults that the children should not overstrain themselves in their free time, not read too much and not stay awake too late in the evening. Secretly, parents sensed a certain unruliness of mind which was incompatible with the efficient division of human life. Besides, the prevalent ethos is suspicious of anything which is miscellaneous, or heterogeneous, of anything which has not clearly and unambiguously been assigned to its place. The rigorous bifurcation of life enjoins the same reification, which has now almost completely subjugated free time. This subjugation can be clearly seen at work in the hobby ideology. The naturalness of the question of what hobby you have harbors the assumption that you must have one, or better still, that you should have a range of different hobbies, in accordance with what the leisure industry can supply. Organized freedom is compulsory. Woe betide you if you have no hobby, no pastime. Then you are a swot or an old-timer, an eccentric, and you will fall prey to ridicule in a society which foists upon you what your free time should be. Such compulsion is by no means merely external in character. It is linked to the inner needs of people in the functional system. Camping, an activity so popular, was a protest against the tedium and convention of bourgeois life. People had to get out, in both senses of the phrase. Sleeping out beneath the stars meant that one had escaped from the house and from the family. After the youth movements had died out, this need was then harnessed and institutionalized by the camping industry. The industry alone could not have forced people to uppercase its tents and dormobiles, plus huge quantities of extra equipment, if there had not already been some longing in people themselves, but their own need for freedom gets functionalized. Amongst the old youth movements, free time T9, extended and reproduced by business, what they want is forced upon them once again. Hence the ease with which the free time is integrated. People are unaware of how utterly unfree they are, even where they feel most at liberty, because the rule of such unfreedom has been abstracted from them, taken in its strict sense. In contradistinction to work, as it at least used to apply in what would today be considered an outdated ideology, there is something vacuous, Hegel would have said abstract, about the notion of free time. An archetypal instance is the behavior of those who grill themselves brown in the sun merely for the sake of a suntan. Although dozing in the blazing sunshine is not at all enjoyable, might very possibly be physically unpleasant, and certainly impoverishes the mind. In the suntan, which can be quite fetching, the fetish character of the commodity lays claim to actual people. They themselves become fetishes. The idea that a girl is more erotically attractive because of her brown skin is probably only another rationalization. The suntan is an end in itself, of more importance than the boyfriend it was perhaps supposed to entice. If employees return from their holidays without having acquired the mandatory skin tone, they can be quite sure their colleagues will ask them the pointed question, haven't you been on holiday then? The fetishism which thrives in free time is subject to further social controls. It is obvious that the cosmetics industry with its overwhelming and ineluctable advertisements is a contributory factor here, but people's willingness to ignore the obvious is just as great. The act of dozing in the sun marks the culmination of a crucial element of free time under present conditions: boredom. The miracles which people expect from their holidays or from other special treats in their free time are subject to endless spiteful ridicule, since even here they never get beyond the threshold of the Everson. Distant places are no longer, as they still were for Baudelaire's ennui, different places. The victim's ridicule is automatically connected to the very mechanisms which victimize. At an early age, Schopenhauer formulated a theory of boredom. True to his metaphysical pessimism, he teaches that people either suffer from the unfulfilled desires of their blind will, or become bored as soon as these desires are satisfied. The theory well describes what the common of people's free time under T92 the culture industry, the sort of conditions of heteronomy, and which in New German tends to be termed Frim best in fate, external determination. In its cynicism, Schopenhauer's arrogant remark that mankind is the factory product of nature also captures something of what the totality of the commodity character actually makes man into. Angry cynicism still does more honor to human beings than solemn protestations about man's irreducible essence. However, one should not apostatize Schopenhauer's doctrine as something of universal validity or even as an insight into the primal character of the human species. Boredom is a function of life which is lived under the compulsion to work, and under the strict division of labor. It need not be so, whenever behavior in spare time is truly autonomous, determined by free people for themselves. Boredom rarely figures. It need not figure in activities which cater merely for the desire for pleasure, any more than it does in those free time activities which are reasonable and meaningful in themselves. Even fooling about need not be crass, and can be enjoyed as a blessed release from the throes of self-control. If people were able to make their own decisions about themselves and their lives, if they were not caught up in the realm of the ever-same, they would not have to be bored. Boredom is a reflection of objective dullness. As such, it is in a similar position to political apathy. The most compelling reason for apathy is the by no means unjustified feeling of the masses that political participation within the sphere society grants them, and this holds true for all political systems in the world today, can alter their actual existence only minimally. Failing to discern the relevance of politics to their own interests, they retreat from all political activity. The well-founded or indeed neurotic feeling of powerlessness is intimately bound up with boredom. Boredom is objective desperation. It is also, however, symptomatic of the deformations perpetrated upon man by the social totality, the most important of which is surely the deformation and atrophy of the imagination fantasy. Imagination is suspected of being only sexual curiosity and longing for the forbidden by the spirit, Geist, of the science which is no longer spirit. Those who want to adapt must learn increasingly to curb their imagination. For the most part, the very development of the imagination is crippled by the experience of early childhood. The lack of imagination which is cultivated and inculcated by society renders people helpless in their free time. The free time T93 impertinent question of what people should do with the vast amount of free time now at their disposal, as if it was a question of arms and not human rights, is based upon this very unimaginativeness. The reason why people can actually do so little with their free time is that the truncation of their imagination deprives them of the faculty which made the state of freedom pleasurable in the first place. People have been refused freedom, and its value belittled, for such a long time that now people no longer like it. They need the shallow entertainment, by means of which cultural conservatism patronizes and humiliates them, in order to summon up the strength for work, which is required of them under the arrangement of society which cultural conservatism defends. This is one good reason why people have remained chained to their work, and to a system which trains them for work, long after that system has ceased to require their labor. Under prevailing conditions, it would be erroneous and foolish to expect or to demand that people should be genuinely productive in their free time. For productivity, the ability to bring forth something that was not already there, is the very thing which has been eradicated from them. At best, what they then produce in free time is scarcely better than the ominous hobby, the imitation of poems or pictures which, given the almost irrevocable division of labor, others could do better than these amateurs. Friesitler. What they create has something superfluous about it. This superfluousness makes known the inferior quality of the product, which in turn vitiates any pleasure taken in its production. Even the most superfluous and senseless activity undertaken in people's free time is integrated in society. Once again, a social need is at work. Certain forms of service, in particular domestic servants, are dying out. Demand is disproportionate to supply. In America, only the really wealthy can afford to keep servants, and Europe is following close behind. This means that many people carry out activities which were formerly delegated. The slogan "do it yourself" latches onto this as practical advice. However, it also latches onto the resentment which people feel towards mechanization, which unburdens people. Without and not the fact itself but only its current interpretation is a matter of dispute, there having any use for the newly acquired time. Thus, once again in the interests of certain specialized industries, people are, T94 the culture industry, encouraged to perform tasks, which others could do more simply and more proficiently for them, and which for this very reason, deep down, they must despise. Actually, the idea that one can save the money one spends on services, in a society based upon the division of labor, belongs to a very old level of bourgeois consciousness. It is an economy made from stubborn self-interest, an economy which flies in the face of the fact that it is only the exchange of specialized skills which keeps the whole mechanism going in the first place. William Tell, the obnoxious paradigm of absolute individuality, proclaimed that the household axe spared the need for the carpenter. Indeed, a whole ontology of bourgeois consciousness could be compiled from Schiller's maxims. Do it yourself. This contemporary type of spare time behavior fits, however, into a much more far-reaching context. More than 30 years ago I described such behavior as pseudo-activity. Since then pseudo-activity has spread alarmingly, even, and especially, amongst those people who regard themselves as anti-establishment. Generally speaking, there is good reason to assume that all forms of pseudo-activity contain a pent-up need to change the petrified relations of society. Pseudo-activity is misguided spontaneity. Misguided, but not accidentally so, because people do have a dim suspicion of how hard it would be to throw off the yoke that weighs upon them. They prefer to be distracted by spurious and illusory activities, by institutionalized, vicarious satisfactions, than to face up to the awareness of how little access they have to the possibility of change today. Pseudo-activities are fictions and parodies of the same productivity which society on the one hand incessantly calls for, but on the other holds in check and, as far as the individual is concerned, does not really desire at all. Product. Free time is only possible for people who have outgrown their tutelage, not for those who under conditions of heteronomy have become heteronomous for themselves. Free time then does not merely stand in opposition to labor. In a system where full employment itself has become the ideal, free time is nothing more than a shadowy continuation of labor. As yet we still lack an incisive sociology of sport, and particularly of the spectator. Nevertheless, one hypothesis, amongst others, springs to mind, namely that, by dint of the physical exertion exacted by sport, by dint of the functionalization of the body and team activity, which interestingly, free time 95, enough occurs in the most popular sports. People are unwittingly trained into modes of behavior which, sublimated to a greater or lesser degree, are required of them by the work process. The accepted reason for playing sport is that it makes believe that fitness itself is the sole, independent end of sport, whereas fitness for work is certainly one of the covert ends of sport. Frequently it is in sport that people first inflict upon themselves, and celebrate as a triumph of their own freedom, precisely what society inflicts upon them and what they must learn to enjoy. Let me say a little more on the relation of free time and the culture industry. Since Horkheimer and I coined the term more than 30 years ago, so much has been written about this means of domination and integration, that I should like to pick out a particular problem, which at the time we were not able to gain a proper perspective on. The ideology critic, dealing with the culture industry, and working on the premise that the standards of the culture industry are the ossified standards of what was formerly entertainment and low art, has the tendency to believe that the culture industry totally and utterly dominates and controls both the conscious and the unconscious of those people at whom it is directed, the same people out of whose taste during the liberal era the culture industry grew. Nevertheless, there is reason to believe that production regulates consumption in the process of mental life, just as it does in that of material life, especially where the former has so closely approximated the latter, as it has in the culture industry. One would have thought the culture industry was perfectly adapted to its consumers, but since the culture industry has meanwhile become total itself a phenomenon of the ever same, from which it promises temporarily to divert people, it is doubtful whether the culture industry and consumer consciousness can be simply equated with one another. A few years ago at the Frankfurt Institute for Social conducted a study devoted to this problem. Unfortunately, the full analysis of this material was postponed in favor of more pressing tasks. Nevertheless, a passing inspection of it does reveal something which might well be relevant to the so-called problem of free time. The study concerned the wedding of Princess Beatrix of Holland with the junior German diplomat Klaus von Amsberg. The objective was to assess the reactions of the German research we, T96 the culture industry, public to the wedding, which was broadcast by all the mass media, dwelt on incessantly by the illustrated weeklies, and so consumed by the public in their free time. Since the way in which the event was presented, like the articles written about it, accorded it an unusual degree of importance, we expected the spectators and readers to treat it just as seriously. In particular, we expected to observe the operation of the characteristic contemporary ideology of personalization, through which, as a clear compensation for the functionalization of reality, the value of individual people and private relationships is immeasurably overestimated in comparison to actual social determinants. I should now like to say with due caution that these expectations were too simplistic. In fact, the study offers a virtually textbook example of how critical theoretical thought can both learn from and be corrected by empirical social research. It was possible to detect symptoms of a split consciousness. On the one hand, people enjoyed it as a concrete event in the here and now, quite unlike anything else in their everyday life. It was to be a unique experience, ein Molek, to use a cliché beloved of modern jurymen. To this extent, the reaction of the audience corresponded to the familiar pattern, according to which even the relevant, possibly political news was transformed into a consumer item by the way in which the information was transmitted. The format of our interview, however, was devised in such a way that the questions concerned with determining the immediate reactions of the viewers were supplemented by control questions about the political significance that the interviewees ascribed to the grand event. Here it turned out that many of the people interviewed, we shall ignore the exact proportion, suddenly showed themselves to be thoroughly realistic, and proceeded to evaluate critically the political and social importance of the same event, the well-publicized once-in-a-lifetime nature of which they had drooled over breathlessly in front of their television sets. What the culture industry presents people with in their free time, if my conclusions are not too hasty, is indeed consumed and accepted, but with a kind of reservation, in the same way that even the most naive theater or film-goers do not simply take what they behold there for real. Perhaps one can go even further and say that it is not quite believed in. It is obvious that the integration of consciousness and free time has not yet completely succeeded. The real interests of individuals are still, free time 97, strong enough to resist, within certain limits, total inclusion. That would concur with the social prediction that a society, whose inherent contradictions persist undiminished, cannot be totally integrated even in consciousness. Society cannot have it all its own way, especially not in free time, which does indeed lay claim to people, but by its very nature still cannot totally claim them without pushing them over the edge. I shall refrain from spelling out the consequences, but I think that we can here glimpse a chance of maturity, Mundakit, which might just eventually help to turn free time into freedom proper. 9. Resignation. We older representatives of that for which the name Frankfurt School has established itself have recently had the reproach of resignation leveled against us. We had, it is stated, developed elements of a critical theory of society, but we were not prepared to draw the practical consequences from this theory. We neither designed programs for action nor did we support the actions of those who felt themselves inspired by critical theory. I shall sidestep the question whether this demand can be made at all upon theoretical thinkers who always remain to a certain degree sensitive and by no means unshakable instruments. The task assigned such individuals within a society characterized by the division of labor might indeed be questionable. They themselves might well be deformed by it, but they have also been formed by it, and there is no way in which they can repeal that which they have become merely through an act of their own will. I should not want to deny the impulse of subjective weakness inherent in the confinement to theory. The objection raised against us can be stated approximately in these words: a person who in the present hour doubts the possibility of radical change in society and who for that reason neither takes part in nor recommends spectacular, violent action is guilty of resignation. He does not consider the vision of change which he once held capable of realization. Indeed, he actually had no true resignation T99 desire to see it realized in the first place. In leaving conditions as they are, He offers his tacit approval of them. Distance from praxis is disreputable in the eyes of everyone. Anyone who does not take immediate action and who is not willing to get his hands dirty is the subject of suspicion. It is felt that his antipathy toward such action was not legitimate, and further that his view has even been distorted by the privileges he enjoys. Distrust of those who distrust praxis extends from those on the opposite side, who repeat the old slogan, "We've had enough of talking," all the way to the objective spirit of advertising, which propagates the picture. It's called Lichtbild or image as motif of the actively involved human being. No matter whether his activity lies in the realm of economics or athletics, one should take part. Whoever restricts himself to thinking but does not get involved is weak, cowardly and virtually a traitor. This hostile cliché on the intellectual is to be encountered with deep roots within that branch of the opposition that is in turn reviled as intellectual without any awareness thereof on their part. Thinking activists answer, among the things to be changed is that very separation of theory and praxis. Praxis is essential if we are ever to be liberated from the domination of practical people and practical ideals. The trouble with this view is that it results in the prohibition of thinking. Very little is needed to turn the resistance against repression repressively against those who, little as they might wish to glorify their state of being, do not desert the standpoint that they have come to occupy. The often evoked unity of theory and praxis has a tendency to give way to the predominance of praxis. Numerous views define theory itself as a form of repression, as though praxis did not stand in a far more direct relationship to repression. For Marx, the dogma of this unity was animated by the imminent possibility of action which even then was not to be realized. Today it is rather the opposite situation that prevails. One clings to action because of the impossibility of action. But Marx himself reveals a concealed wound in this regard. He no doubt delivered the 11th thesis on Feuerbach in such an authoritarian fashion because he was not at all sure of it himself. In his youth he had demanded the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. Now he mocked criticism. But his famous joke about the young Hegelians, his coinage critical criticism, was a dud and went up in smoke as nothing but a tautology. The forced 200 The culture industry, precedents of praxis brought the criticism which Marx himself practiced to an irrational halt. In Russia and in the orthodoxy of other countries, the malicious mockery of critical criticism became the instrument that permitted the status quo to establish itself in such horrifying fashion. The only meaning that praxis retained was this: increased production of the means of production. The only criticism still tolerated was that people still were not working hard enough. This demonstrates how easily the subordination of theory to praxis results in the support of renewed repression. Repressive intolerance toward a thought not immediately accompanied by instructions for action is founded in fear. Unmanipulated thought in the position that allows nothing to be deduced from this thought must be feared because that which cannot be admitted is perfectly clear. This thought is right. An aged bourgeois mechanism with which the men of the Enlightenment of the 18th century were very familiar displays itself anew but unchanged. Suffering caused by a negative condition, in this case by abstracted reality, turns into anger toward the person who expresses it. Thought, enlightenment conscious of itself, threatens to disenchant pseudo-reality within which, according to Habermas' formulation, activism moves. This activism is tolerated only because it is viewed as pseudo-activity. Pseudo-activity is allied with pseudo-reality in the design of a subjective position, an activity that overplays itself and fires itself up for the sake of its own publicity without admitting to what degree it serves as a substitute for satisfaction, thus elevating itself to an end in itself. All those behind bars are despondent in their desire to be released. In such situations one no longer thinks or thinks only in fictive postulates. Within absolutized praxis, only reaction is possible, and for this reason the reaction is false. Only thinking could offer an escape, and then only that thinking, the results of which are not prescribed as is so frequently the case in those discussions in which it is predetermined who is right and which therefore do not advance the cause, but rather degenerate without fail into tactics. When the doors are barricaded, it is doubly important that thought not be interrupted. It is rather the task of thought to analyze the reasons behind this situation and to draw the consequences from these reasons. It is the responsibility of thought not to accept the situation as finite. If there is any chance of changing the resignation 201 situation, it is only through undiminished insight. The leap into praxis will not cure thought from resignation as long as it is paid for with the secret knowledge that this course is simply not the right one. Generally speaking, pseudo-activity is the attempt to preserve enclaves of immediacy in the midst of a thoroughly mediated and obdurate society. This process is rationalized through the acceptance of any small change as one step on the long way toward total change. The unfortunate model for pseudo-activity is the do-it-yourself syndrome, activities that do that which has long been done better through the means of industrial production and which arouse in unfree individuals, hampered in their spontaneity, the confident feeling that they are of central concern. The nonsense of a do-it-yourself approach to the production of material goods and in the making of many repairs is equally obvious. However, it is not total, in view of the reduction of so-called services, sometimes superfluous in terms of technical standards, measures taken by a private person fuel a semi-rational purpose. In politics, however, the do-it-yourself attitude is not of quite the same character. The society that confronts human beings in such an impenetrable manner is these humans themselves. Confidence in the limited action of small groups is reminiscent of the spontaneity which atrophies beneath the encrusted totality and without which this totality cannot be transformed into something different. The administered world has a tendency to strangle all spontaneity or at least to channel it into pseudo-activity. This, however, is not achieved so totally without difficulty as the agents of the administered world would like to imagine. Nonetheless, spontaneity is not to be absolutized, just as little as it is to be separated from the objective situation and idolized in the same manner as is the administered world itself. Otherwise the axe will break down the next process which never spares the carpenter, and the riot squad will appear on the spot. Political acts of violence can also sink to the level of pseudo-activity, resulting in mere theater. It is hardly a wonder that the ideal of direct action and propaganda glorifying the deed have been resurrected, upon the heels of the whirling integration of formerly progressive organizations that, in all lands of the earth, manifest the character of that against which they were once directed. This process, however, has not weakened the criticism of Door in the House. 202 The culture industry, anarchism, the return of which is the return of a ghost. The impatience toward theory manifested in this return does nothing to advance thought beyond itself. theory falls behind the thought which it forgets. For the individual, life is made easier through capitulation to the collective with which he identifies. He is spared the cognition of his impotence. Within the circle of their own company, the few become many. It is this act, not unconfused thinking, which is resignation. No transparent relation prevails between the interests of the ego and the collective to which it assigns itself. The ego must abrogate itself, if it is to share in the predestination of the collective. Explicitly, a remnant of the Kantian categorical imperative manifests itself. Your signature is required. The feeling of a new security is purchased with the sacrifice of autonomous thinking. The consolation that thought within the context of collective action is an improvement proves deceptive. Thinking, employed only as the instrument of action, is blunted in the same manner as all instrumental reason. At the present moment, no higher form of society is concretely visible. For that reason, anything that seems an easy reach is regressive. According to Freud, however, whoever regresses has not achieved the goal of his drives. Objectively viewed, reformation is renunciation, even if it considers itself the opposite and innocently propagates the pleasure principle. In contrast, the uncompromisingly critical thinker, who neither superscribes his conscience nor permits himself to be terrorized into action, is in truth the one who does not give up. Furthermore, thinking is not the spiritual reproduction of that which exists. As long as thinking is not interrupted, it has a firm grasp upon possibility. Its insatiable quality, the resistance against petty satiety, rejects the foolish wisdom of resignation. The utopian impulse in thinking is all the stronger, the less it objectifies itself as utopia, a further form of regression, whereby it sabotages its own realization. Open thinking points beyond itself. For its part, such thinking takes a position as a figuration of praxis which is more closely related to a praxis truly involved in change than in a position of mere obedience for the sake of praxis. Beyond all specialized and particular content, thinking is actually and above all the force of resistance, alienated from resistance only with great effort. This emphatic concept of thinking is by no means secure. No security is granted by existing conditions nor by the ends yet to be attained nor, resignation 203, by any type of organized force. Whatever was once thought, however, can be suppressed. It can be forgotten and can even vanish, but it cannot be denied that something of it survives. For thinking has the momentum of the general. What has been cogently thought must be thought in some other place and by other people. This confidence accompanies even the loneliest and most impotent thought. Whoever thinks is without anger in all criticism. Thinking sublimates anger, because the thinking person does not have to inflict anger upon himself. He furthermore has no desire to inflict it upon others. The happiness visible to the eye of a thinker is the happiness of mankind. The universal tendency toward suppression goes against thought as such. Such thought is happiness. Even where unhappiness prevails, thought achieves happiness in the expression of unhappiness. Whoever refuses to permit this thought to be taken from him has not resigned. Note 1. This sentence was recently used in Der Spiegel as a headline for a brief article on the relationship of the Frankfurt School to terror as recently manifested in the German Federal Republic. Name index, Adorno, TW 127, Aeschylus 170 and 200, name index 2, indexed, subject index, advert 210. The culture industry, musical fetishism 36.